There is a moment in the opening titles of Adventure Time where the camera drifts across a green field, and lying there in the grass, half swallowed by moss and flowers, is the wreckage of a world that looks a lot like ours. A ruined vehicle, old machinery going soft under 1,000 years of weather. It flickers past in a second or two, and for years most of us just accepted it as set dressing, a bit of whimsical junk, and never once asked what it was doing there. It turns out that little pile of rust is the whole story. It is the answer to a question the series takes the better part of its run to ask out loud. Tonight on Marcy, we are going all the way down the Adventure Time iceberg. From the things every casual viewer knows at the surface, down through the fan lore, down past the deep cosmic stuff, all the way to the cold, quiet bottom, where the production secrets and the buried tragedies live. So get comfortable, turn the lights down low, let your eyes go soft, and if you have not subscribed yet, it genuinely does help us keep making these long ones for you to drift off to. Let us start at the top of the iceberg, where the water is warm and everything looks like a children's cartoon, because that is exactly where Adventure Time wants you to start. On the surface, it is one of the simplest pitches in television. A boy and his dog go on adventures. The boy is Finn the human, the dog is Jake, and Jake is magical, a shape-shifting dog who can stretch any part of his body to almost any size, turn himself into a boat or a house or a fist as big as a mountain. They live together in a treehouse in a place called the Land of Oo, and most days they wander out looking for something to do, someone to help, a dungeon to poke around in, a princess to save, and then they come home again. That is the format. That is what you would tell someone who asked what it was about and gave you 10 seconds to answer. For a good stretch of the early episodes, that really is all it is. A loose, sweet, extremely strange comedy where the plots barely connect to each other, and the pleasure is entirely in the texture, in the character voices, the throwaway jokes, the sense that anything at all could happen next and probably will. Adventure Time was created by a man named Pendleton Ward, and it premiered on Cartoon Network on the 5th of April 2010. It ran for 10 seasons and ended on the 3rd of September 2018, a remarkably long life for an animated series, and across those 10 seasons it produced 283 episodes. Those are the hard numbers, and I am giving them to you up front, because we are about to move away from hard numbers and into much stranger territory, and it helps to have the shape of the thing in your head first. 8 years, 10 seasons, 283 episodes. A cartoon that started life as a viral internet short and ended as about as patiently ambitious a piece of storytelling as American television animation has ever produced. And here is the part that makes an iceberg video like this even possible. Almost nobody who started watching in 2010 had the faintest idea what they were actually signing up for. At the surface, you have the cast that everybody recognizes, even if they never sat through a full episode. There is Finn, the human boy in the white hat with the 2 little ears on it, brave to the point of recklessness, good-hearted in a way the series takes very seriously. There is Jake, the yellow dog, older and lazier and wiser in a scattered sort of way, voiced with a warm, rumbling delivery that anchors every scene he stands in. There is Princess Bubblegum, the pink ruler of the Candy Kingdom, a scientist as much as a monarch. There is the Ice King, the blue-skinned wizard with the long white beard and the crown, who spends the early years kidnapping princesses and being a nuisance, the closest thing to a standard cartoon villain the story has. There is Marceline the Vampire Queen, a floating gray-skinned rock musician with an axe-shaped bass guitar and a 1,000-yard stare. And there is Bimo, the little living video game console who talks, a small green robot with a screen for a face, arguably the best-loved character in the whole thing. That is your surface roster, the faces on the merchandise, the ones you would find on a lunchbox. And here is the first thing worth saying plainly before we sink any lower. Every single one of those surface-level characters has a bottom of the iceberg hidden underneath them. The nuisance villain who kidnaps princesses is one of the saddest figures in the entire series. The floating rock musician is over 1,000 years old and has watched almost everyone she ever loved die or forget her. The scientist princess is around 800 years old and has done things that would not look out of place in a much darker story. Even the sweet little robot has a hidden depth that Adventure Time saves for one of its final specials. The surface is a children's comedy. The rest of the iceberg is one long meditation on memory, loss, and what it costs to keep living after your whole world has ended. That gap, the distance between what this cartoon looks like and what it actually is is what makes it endlessly interesting, and it is what we are going to spend the next couple of hours slowly sinking through. The theme song sits right at the very top, and it is so short you could miss it. It is the one that goes, "Come on, grab your friends," and lists a handful of the characters, and it is over in a few seconds before the episode begins. What most people never learn, sitting there humming it, is that it was written and sung by Pendleton Ward himself, the creator, with help from the composer Casey Basichis. Ward's own slightly reedy, off-the-cuff voice is the one you have heard hundreds of times without ever putting a name to it. The song at the other end, the gentle one that plays over the credits, the one that goes, "Come Along With Me," is a real indie track called Island Song by a band named Lake, sung by Ashley Erickson. It was a pre-existing piece of music the crew licensed, and it grew so tied to the series that its opening line ended up as the title of the finale. The bookends of every episode, the little burst at the front and the soft fade at the back, were both made by people the average viewer has never heard of, and both of them tell you something about the taste behind the whole enterprise. It always kept one foot planted in small, sincere, handmade indie art, even while it was a flagship program on a major children's network. Let me linger at the surface a moment longer, because the surface is where the best trick is hidden. The land of Ooh, the setting, looks like pure fantasy. There are candy people and fire people and talking animals and wizards and a floating cloud kingdom. It reads, at first glance, like a made-up world with made-up rules. The kind of place you find in a lot of children's cartoons, disconnected from anything real. That reading is wrong. It was always wrong. It was wrong from that first slow pan across the wrecked field in the opening titles. Ooh is not another world. It is our world. It is Earth, our actual Earth. Roughly 1,000 years in the future, long after a catastrophe wiped away the civilization we live in now. But you are not told that on day one. You are allowed to assume you are watching fantasy, and then, slowly, over years, the evidence starts appearing in plain sight, until you cannot ignore it anymore. That slow reveal is the first real step down the iceberg, so that is where we are going next. The reveal that the land of Ooh is really a post-apocalyptic Earth is, for my money, the finest magic trick in the whole series, because of how patient it is. Most stories that carry a twist like this build toward it, and then deliver it in one big scene, a curtain pulled back, a character saying the words aloud. Adventure Time does the opposite. It scatters the truth across years of background art and offhand lines, and lets you assemble it yourself, so that by the time it finally confirms the thing, you feel less like you have been handed a secret, and more like you have finally admitted something you already knew. In the very early episodes, it all lives in the corners of the frame. A rusted-out car body in a ditch, a television set lying on its side in the grass, broken slabs of concrete and steel that plainly belong to buildings, to roads, to a technological society that no longer exists. Fragments of the world you and I live in, sitting there behind a candy-colored cartoon, weathered down to almost nothing. Then the word itself starts slipping through. The Mushroom War. That is the name of the catastrophe that ended the old world. A nuclear war. The mushroom in the name being the mushroom cloud. A global conflict that devastated the planet roughly 1,000 years before Finn and Jake are running around in it. The old human civilization, our civilization, was almost entirely wiped out. And this is the strange, beautiful mechanism the series invents to explain why the ruined Earth is suddenly full of magic and candy people and talking dogs. In this world's mythology, magic had actually been draining out of the Earth across human history, fading, nearly gone by the time of the war. The catastrophe reversed it. The war, and specifically a certain mutagenic bomb dropped in its final days, flooded magic back into the world and mutated the survivors, warping living things into entirely new forms. That is where the candy people came from. That is where a great many of the strange new races of Ooh came from. In the story's own internal logic, they are the mutated descendants of a broken world, life reshaping itself out of the wreckage of ours. Once you know that, the whole texture changes underneath you. Every candy citizen is walking around on top of a mass grave. Every dungeon Finn and Jake crawl into is somebody's ruined office building, or subway station, or bunker. The magical fantasy landscape is a graveyard with flowers growing over it, and the flowers are the story. I think this is why it ages so well, and why it landed so hard on adults who came to it expecting nothing. This is a series about children playing in the ruins of the world their ancestors destroyed, and it never once lectures you about that. It just quietly makes it true in the background, and trusts you to feel it. The apocalypse here is not a plot to be solved. It already happened. It is over. The characters are living in the long, strange afterward, and the tone of that afterward, hopeful and sad in the same breath, kids laughing in a haunted house, is the emotional key the entire run is written in. There is a real question, one the fandom has argued over for years, about who actually started the Mushroom War, and I want to be careful here, because this is a place where it is very easy to state a theory as though it were fact. The honest answer is that Adventure Time never definitively tells you who started it. It never lays out a clean chain of cause and blame. What it gives you instead are pieces, and the reading most fans have assembled from those pieces is that the ancient evil of this universe, a being we will reach much further down, manipulated humanity into destroying itself, and that the very bomb which ended the war is also the thing that gave that evil its physical form. So the theory goes, the war and the birth of the great villain are the same event, a loop, the end of one world becoming the beginning of the monster that haunts the next. It is a genuinely elegant idea, and there is real evidence for it in the background, but it is an interpretation, a strong and well-supported one, not a line of dialogue where someone announces it. So hold it loosely. What we know for certain is that there was a nuclear war, that it nearly ended the human race, and that everything else grows up out of that ground. The other thing the Future Earth premise does is turn the story's occasional bursts of real-world imagery into gut punches instead of jokes. Once you understand where and when all of this is set, a stray reference to our present, an old photograph, a scrap of pre-war technology, a human artifact somebody in OO treats as an inexplicable relic, stops being a cute anachronism and becomes a fragment of the dead world. There is an emotional register available here that most cartoons simply cannot reach, because most cartoons are set in invented places with no connection to us. This one is set in the ashes of us. When somebody in OO picks up an object we recognize and has no idea what it is, that is not a gag. That is the future looking back at us and not remembering our names. The crew knew exactly how powerful that was, which is why they never overused it. They saved those moments, doled them out, let each one land and moved on before you could catch your breath. I said the surface characters all have depths, and the one where the gap between surface and depth is widest, the one that turns the whole Future Earth premise from a clever piece of world building into something that can genuinely break you, is the Ice King. So let me take you down to him, because to understand the Ice King you first have to understand that he is not really the Ice King at all, and that the series spends years earning the right to tell you who he actually is. For most of the first 3 seasons, the Ice King is a joke, and a slightly pathetic one. He is the guy who keeps kidnapping princesses, not because he is truly cruel, but because he is desperately lonely and has completely lost the ability to connect with anyone. He wants a wife. He cannot grasp that you do not get one by abducting royalty and forcing them to marry you. He talks to his penguins. He wanders his freezing mountain fortress, delivering rambling monologues to nobody at all. He is comic relief, an obstacle, a nuisance Finn and Jake swat away roughly once an episode, and if nothing more had ever been done with him, he would have made a perfectly serviceable cartoon villain, and no one would have thought twice. But so much more is done with him. By the end, you cannot watch those early episodes the same way, because you know what you are actually looking at, which is a man who has lost his entire mind and has no idea it is gone. The truth is that the Ice King used to be a human being named Simon Petrikov. Before the Mushroom War, back when the old human world still stood, Simon was an ordinary man, an antiquarian, someone who studied and collected old objects, and he was engaged to a woman named Betty Groff, and by every account they were happy. Then Simon found a crown, an ancient magic crown, forged ages ago by an ice elemental, and when he put it on, it did 2 things at once. It filled his head with power and visions, and the ability to work ice magic, and it began, slowly, to devour him, to eat his memories, to erode who he was. The crown grants its wearer enormous power and a kind of near immortality, but the price it extracts is the self. The longer Simon wore it, and he wore it for something like 1,000 years, the less of Simon was left behind, until the man was almost entirely gone and only the Ice King remained, a creature who does not remember he was ever anyone else, who does not remember Betty, who does not remember being loved or being sane. The reason this is one of the great gut punches of the whole run is the timing of the reveal and the way it reframes the comedy. When you first learn Simon's story, you have already spent seasons laughing at the Ice King, rolling your eyes at his schemes, treating him exactly the way the other characters treat him, as a punchline with legs. And then you are gently informed that everything you found funny was the wreckage of a good man who lost himself trying to survive the end of everything he knew. His loneliness is not a bit. It is the residue of a person who truly loved someone and can no longer hold on to the memory of her face. His nonsense is not simply nonsense. It is the sound of a mind that has been hollowed out. Adventure Time pulls off the difficult trick of making you complicit in the joke, and then forcing you to reckon with what the joke actually was. And I think that is the sharpest emotional move it ever pulls, this business of retroactively breaking your heart over something you had been trained to laugh at. The relationship between Simon and Betty is the thread the entire tragedy hangs on, because Betty does not simply vanish. At the moment Simon first put on the crown and began to change, Betty saw what was happening to the man she loved, and could not accept it, and her whole arc, when she finally re-enters the story much later, is one long refusal to let him go. She becomes obsessed with fixing the crown, with undoing what it did, with finding some way to have Simon back the way he was. That obsession is at once a great romance and a slow ruin, because it consumes her the way the crown consumed him. Two people wrecked in mirror image, one hollowed out by a magic he could not resist, the other burned up by a love she could not let die. We will return to how their story ends much further down, because it ties directly into the biggest cosmic forces in the whole cosmology, and it closes on an ending as devastating as any cartoon has ever committed to. For now, hold on to this. The Silly Wizard with the Crown is a love story that came apart in the ruins of the old one. There is a piece of this that lives even deeper, and it is the reason a lot of longtime fans point to one particular early episode as the moment they understood the series was operating on a level nobody expected. In a fourth season episode, the present-day Ice King, in one of his lucid, confused moments, comes across some old letters. Letters that Simon wrote long ago as his mind was falling apart, and there is a song built out of those letters. A song about remembering and being remembered. The devastating detail is that the Ice King, reading his own words aloud, no longer understands them. He does not know that he wrote them. He does not know who they were for. The man who begged someone to remember him in those desperate, tender letters is gone, and the thing left holding the paper feels only a vague, confused sadness it cannot name. That song was written by a storyboard artist named Rebecca Sugar, who we will talk about a great deal later, because she goes on to become enormously important both to this show and to animation as a whole. But that song, sitting in the middle of what was still nominally a kid's comedy, is where a lot of people fell permanently in love with Adventure Time, and it is where the Ice King stopped being a villain and became the saddest man in Ooh. And the letters were written to a little girl, because Simon, in the aftermath of the war, in that ruined world, before the crown had fully taken him, was not alone. He was caring for a child, a gray-skinned little girl he found wandering the wreckage, whom he protected and fed and comforted and tried to keep safe, even as his own mind crumbled underneath him. That little girl grows up to be Marceline the Vampire Queen, and the bond between them, the father and daughter who found each other at the collapse of one world and lost each other to a crown, is the emotional spine the entire series is quietly built around. So let us go to Marceline, because she has been standing at the edge of every scene so far, ancient and remembering everything, and she deserves her own descent. Marceline has been alive for more than 1,000 years. That is the fact you have to begin with, because everything about her guardedness, her sarcasm, her wandering, the way she holds herself at a slight distance from the ordinary happiness of the others, comes out of the plain arithmetic of all those centuries in a world that kept ending and rebuilding itself. She looks like a teenager. A lot of the time she acts like one, playing her bass, teasing her friends, being difficult on purpose. But she has watched empires of candy rise and fall. She was a child when the bombs dropped. She remembers the old human world, or at least the tail end of it, better than almost anyone still breathing. The Vampire Queen is a survivor in the plainest sense, someone who has outlived everyone and everything and had to build a personality capable of carrying that weight without buckling under it. Her origins are a tangle of this series' two favorite ingredients, the whimsical and the tragic, pressed together until you cannot tell them apart. She is the daughter of a human mother named Elise and a demon father named Hunson Abadir, who rules a place called the Nightosphere, more or less the local version of a chaotic underworld. So she is half human and half demon, born into a lineage that straddles the ordinary and the infernal. But that demon father is also, in one of the best loved and pettiest running jokes in the whole thing, the source of its silliest emotional wound. There is a moment, immortalized in a little song, where the entire grievance between Marceline and her all-powerful, soul-harvesting father comes down to the fact that he once ate her fries. Her fries. She left a note. He ate them anyway, and it is played completely straight, as the defining betrayal of their relationship, this cosmically petty thing, because that is exactly how family resentment actually works. You do not remember the big philosophical disagreements. You remember that he ate your fries. It lands as one of the funniest and truest things in the series precisely because it is so small. But under the demon father and the vampire powers and the rock and roll swagger, the deepest layer of Marceline is Simon. Because after the Mushroom War, when she was a small child alone in the ruins, the person who found her and took care of her was Simon Petrikov. Before the crown had finished taking him, he fed her, he protected her, he gave her a stuffed toy, a little doll named Hambo, which becomes one of her most treasured possessions and a recurring symbol across the whole run of everything she has loved and been afraid to lose. And the unbearable part, the part the story keeps pressing on like a bruise it cannot leave alone, is that Simon was disappearing even as he was saving her. He put on the crown to protect her, used its power to keep her safe, and every time he used it he lost a little more of himself, so that the little girl watched her rescuer, the closest thing she had to a father, slowly turn into a stranger who would eventually not even know her name. She grew up, he forgot her, and for 1,000 years after that, the Ice King and Marceline shared the same world, and he had no idea who she was, and she remembered every bit of it. That is the relationship the series spends its whole run circling, and it is why the 4th season song, built from Simon's letters, hits the way it does. Because by then, you understand that the confused old man reading words he does not recognize is reading them to the very person sitting in front of him, and neither of them can fully cross the gap. When a flicker of Simon finally surfaces and he recognizes her, even for a moment, it is almost too much to bear. A father and daughter who survived the apocalypse together, separated not by death, but by the slow erasure of a mind. There is a later flashback story, which we will reach, that follows the two of them wandering the post-war wasteland keeping each other alive, and it is some of the tenderest material anyone on the crew ever produced. I will only say now that if you watched Adventure Time for nothing but the Simon and Marceline of it all, you would still have watched one of the best things on television. Marceline became the vampire queen the way you might expect, and also not at all the way you might expect. She was not simply born a vampire. She became one through a long and violent history the series eventually unpacks in detail. A history of hunting vampires, of absorbing their powers, and ultimately of killing the vampire king and being bitten in the process, taking his crown and his curse together. So her title is earned, not inherited. She fought her way to it. That history becomes the engine of an entire 8-part miniseries later on, one of the boldest things ever attempted here, which we will descend to when we reach the deeper lore, because it stands among the strongest arcs in the whole run and deserves its own space rather than a rushed summary. One last surface-level thing about Marceline is worth pulling out, because it connects to the real world in a lovely way. She is voiced by an actress named Olivia Olson, and her demon father Hunson Abadir is voiced by Olivia's real-life father, a man named Martin Olson. So the fraught, funny, loving father and daughter dynamic playing out between Marceline and Hunson is being performed by an actual father and daughter. There is something perfect about that, given how much of Marceline's story is about fathers, the demon one who ate her fries, and the human one who forgot her name. The production is full of these little seams where the real people making it bleed into the fiction, and once you start noticing them you cannot stop, which is exactly what an iceberg dive is for. Before we go deeper though, we should look at the other woman at the center of Marceline's life, the one she spends the whole series orbiting, the pink scientist who runs the Candy Kingdom, because Princess Bubblegum has just as much buried under her as anyone. Princess Bubblegum looks, at first glance, like the plainest character in the whole cast. A princess, pink, ruler of a kingdom made of candy. She is the one Finn carries a crush on for a good chunk of the early years, the damsel the plots sometimes revolve around, and if you were only half watching you might file her away as the standard cartoon princess and never think about her again. That would be a mistake, because Bubblegum is one of the most complicated and, honestly, one of the more morally unsettling characters here. She is not a fairy tale princess. She is a scientist who happens to hold absolute power over a nation she, in a very real sense, manufactured. And the series is remarkably willing to look at the darker implications of that and not flinch. Start with her age, because it is the first clue that she is not what she appears. She looks about 18. She is stated to be around 800 years old. Like Marceline, she predates the world we are watching. Her origins trace back to a strange, sentient pink substance, a kind of living ooze, that arose in the aftermath of the war, beneath what would become the Candy Kingdom, and out of that ooze she emerged, along with a brother, and grew into the being we know. So Bubblegum is not simply a monarch who inherited a throne. She is closer to something that grew up out of the ground of the ruined earth, and then organized the world around her into a shape she could rule. That is a very different kind of character than the pink princess she resembles. The detail that reframes her completely is that she created her own subjects. The Candy People, or many of them, are her creations, brought to life by her science. She was lonely, in the way so many characters here are lonely, and she built herself a family, and then a whole population. Once you know that, her relationship to the Candy Kingdom stops looking like rulership and starts looking like something stranger and more total, the bond of a maker to the things she made. She loves them, clearly. She also controls them completely, surveils them, experiments on them, makes decisions about their lives no elected leader could ever get away with, because in a sense, they only exist because she willed them to. This is not presented as straightforwardly evil. It is presented as complicated, as the kind of power even a good person cannot wield cleanly. And you are handed concrete evidence that she will do dark things when she decides they are necessary. There is the story of her family, the candy relatives she made in her lonely early days, an uncle named Gumbald among them, who invented a mind-wiping potion of his own called Dum-Dum Juice, and tried to force it on her, only for her to turn it back on him with a well-placed shot from a pea shooter, so the juice splashed over him instead, and erased his memory, regressing him into a simple, harmless candy citizen with no idea of who he had been. Think about what that actually is. She took a person who opposed her and erased his personality, turned him into a docile subject, and let him live among her people as a blank. It is mind-wiping. It is the kind of thing a villain does in a darker series, and Bubblegum does it and then goes on being the character we are largely meant to root for. That tension, between her benevolence and her authoritarianism, between the good she does and the frankly frightening lengths she will go to, is one of the richest things about her, and it is why she works as an adult character where most cartoon princesses do not. There is a whole later arc built out of exactly this buried history, because Gumbald does not stay wiped forever. The suppressed family conflict, the uncle she erased and the relatives she made and lost, eventually resurfaces and grows into the central political struggle of the final stretch, a war over the Candy Kingdom that the fans call the Gum War. We will get there when we descend into the endgame, because that war is the thing the great cosmic finale interrupts, and it matters that the last big human-scale conflict of the series is not good against evil, but a family feud, Bubblegum herself set in motion centuries ago through her own controlling choices. The story is very interested in the idea that the monsters in your life are often the ones you made, and Bubblegum is the clearest expression of it. Her most famous experiment, though, and one of the darkest running threads in the entire series, is a lemon-shaped man called the Earl of Lemongrab. Bubblegum created Lemongrab and judged him a failure, an unacceptable experiment, and the result is a character who is deeply disturbing, a shrieking, unstable, profoundly unhappy being, brought into existence broken, and then largely abandoned by his maker. When Bubblegum, feeling guilty about his loneliness, tries to fix it by creating a second Lemongrab to keep him company, it goes horribly wrong in ways I will save for the deeper part of this dive, because the Lemongrab material gets into real body horror, into two lemon men who lock candy prisoners in their dungeon, and grow a horde of lemon citizens so large that one grotesque fused body ends up sprawled through the whole castle, and it is some of the most unsettling material a nominally children's cartoon has ever aired. For now, just add it to the ledger of what Bubblegum has done. She made a life, decided it was a mistake, and the fallout from that decision curdles into some of the darkest imagery in the whole run. She is not a villain, but she is a maker who does not always clean up what she makes, and the story never lets her, or us, off the hook for it. And then there is Marceline. Because the other enormous thing about Princess Bubblegum, the thing the series danced around for years before finally saying it plainly, is her relationship with the vampire queen. These two, the immortal scientist and the immortal musician, the order and the chaos, the pink and the gray, share a history the series treats as the deepest emotional bond either of them has. And the story of how that relationship went from subtext to text, from something that could only be implied, to something finally shown on screen, is one of the more important stories in the history of American children's animation. So that is where we go next, into what the fandom calls Bubbline, and into the years of careful, coded, and sometimes censored storytelling it took to get there. Bubbline is the fandom's name for the relationship between Princess Bubblegum and Marceline, and its journey from hint to canon is a story about what you can and cannot show on children's television, and how much you can smuggle past those limits if you are patient and careful. The earliest strong signals arrive in a third season episode a lot of fans point to as the beginning of it all. On the surface, it is an episode about a stolen possession and a song, but underneath it runs thick with the specific, loaded tension of two people who share a complicated romantic past. There is a moment where Bubblegum wears a shirt that clearly used to belong to Marceline, a small detail that means an enormous amount, the kind of thing you only keep from someone you were once close to. The episode is coded, deniable, the way so much queer subtext in that era of children's media had to be, but it is unmistakably there for anyone looking, and a lot of viewers were looking. The series could not, in those years, simply say what these two were to each other. The constraints on American children's programming around depicting same-sex relationships were real, and they were strict, and the crew had to work in the narrow space between what they could imply and what they could state. What makes the story remarkable is how much they managed to imply, and how the actress who voices Marceline eventually confirmed out loud what the coding had always suggested. At a bookstore signing panel for the Adventure Time Encyclopedia in the summer of 2014, Olivia Olson told the audience plainly that Princess Bubblegum and Marceline used to date. She added that this was something that could not be stated outright within the show itself at the time, because of where it aired and the rules around it. So for years, the situation was that the people making it and voicing the characters knew, and would tell you the truth in interviews, while the story itself could only speak in hints, in loaded glances and borrowed shirts and songs with double meanings. There is a piece of behind-the-scenes history here that belongs on the Iceberg, because it shows how fraught this territory was, even off-screen. A promotional video, a behind-the-scenes piece that discussed the relationship between the two characters, was pulled, taken down, and in the fallout, a staffer connected to it left the studio. I want to be careful to state only what is documented, and not to speculate about the private motives of real people. But the plain facts are that a video acknowledging the relationship was removed, and that there were professional consequences around it. That tells you something about how much resistance there was, at an institutional level, to even acknowledging what the series was clearly doing. The subtext was not an accident, and it was not frictionless. People fought to put it there, and there was pushback against it, and that context makes the eventual payoff land even harder. Because it does pay off. In the series finale, in the middle of the chaos and the fighting, with everything at stake, Marceline and Bubblegum finally have their moment, and the two of them kiss, on screen, unambiguously, canonizing a relationship that had been coded into the margins for the better part of a decade. What is remarkable about the making of that scene is a small detail that has surfaced since. The finale script, as written, reportedly indicated only that the two characters have a moment, a deliberately vague instruction, and it was a storyboard artist named Hannah Nystrom who read that moment as a kiss and boarded it that way. So the defining image of the whole Bubbline arc, the kiss that made it real, came down to one artist's choice about how to interpret a vague line in a script, a choice that then went all the way to air. There is something fitting in that a relationship built entirely out of what individual artists were willing to smuggle into the frame was finally confirmed by exactly the same process. One artist deciding to draw the thing plainly. The relationship did not stop at the finale kiss. In the post-series specials, particularly the one that follows Marceline and Bubblegum to a place called the Glass Kingdom, the crew gets to do what they never could during the network run, which is treat them as an established couple, explore their history and their friction and their tenderness in the open, without coding or deniability. Getting to watch them simply be together, to have their conflicts and reconciliations as a couple rather than as a rumor, is one of the real gifts of the franchise outliving its original home. But the finale kiss is the hinge. It is the moment a decade of careful, contested, sometimes censored storytelling finally broke the surface. And it arrived at a time when it truly meant something for a major animated franchise to say this out loud. Kids watching that finale got to see two women they had grown up with love each other openly, in a way kids a few years earlier simply would not have been allowed to. And I have to mention the flip side, because the iceberg has a cold layer here too. That same kiss, the one that meant so much, was cut in several countries when the finale aired, edited out in places where depicting a same-sex relationship is restricted or outright illegal. So the exact moment that was a milestone for a lot of viewers was, for other viewers elsewhere, simply not there, snipped out so cleanly they might never have known it existed. This is the part that gets me. Honestly, the thought of two versions of the same finale loose in the world, one where the story completes itself, and one with a small hole cut in it right at the climax. It is a reminder that the fight the crew had been waging for a decade was not won everywhere, and that the surface of a story and its full truth can be different things depending on where you happen to be sitting when you watch it, which, in a roundabout way, is the whole theme of this video. Let us keep going down. Before we leave the surface entirely and sink into the cold cosmic stuff, I want to spend a little time on BMO, because BMO is the perfect example of the whole method, a character who reads as pure adorable comic relief and turns out to carry more underneath than almost anyone. BMO is the little living computer, part video game console, part camera, part alarm clock, part roommate, who lives with Finn and Jake and functions as a kind of third child in the household. BMO plays games, tells stories, does little routines, keeps an imaginary friend, wanders into small self-contained adventures that are often among the sweetest and strangest episodes produced. On the surface, BMO is comfort, warmth, the character you put on when you want the series to just be gentle with you for a while. The name itself is a small piece of trivia people love once they hear it. BMO comes from the phrase, be more, spelled out as the letters that make the sound, BMO. Be more. There is a whole little philosophy tucked into that name, an encouragement, an aspiration, handed to a robot who is, in many ways, the warmest heart on the show. And there is a lovely bit of production history behind the voice. BMO was originally imagined with a synthesized, computerized voice, the kind of thing you would expect from a talking console. It was Pendleton Ward who suggested instead using the natural voice of the storyboard artist Nikki Yang, with some adjustment, and that warm, slightly halting, unmistakable delivery became one of the defining sounds of the whole run. Nikki Yang also voices Lady Rainicorn, Jake's partner, speaking Korean. So two of the story's most distinctive voices come from the same person, one of them a storyboard artist rather than a trained voice actor, which tells you a great deal about how homegrown this production really was. One thing the series is careful and consistent about, and it matters to how you read the character, is that BMO has no fixed biological sex. BMO is a robot, and the writing deliberately uses both he and she for BMO at different moments, often within the imaginative play BMO is caught up in, and never settles the question, because the question is not the point. BMO simply is BMO. I think it is worth stating plainly, both because people sometimes get it wrong, and because it is part of the gentle, expansive spirit of the whole thing, which was always more interested in who characters were than in sorting them into boxes. BMO gets to be a knight, a detective, a baby, a parent, a hero, a friend, whatever the story needs, and none of it is ever treated as a contradiction. And then, in the post-series specials, the story does the thing it loves best, which is reach under even its most purely comforting character and find something enormous. The very first of the Distant Lands specials, released in 2020, is a BMO story, and it sends the little robot into a science fiction emergency out in space, far from home, and uses it to explore who BMO is, on a level the series proper never had room for. I will not spoil the shape of it because it is worth watching cold, but I will say it takes the character you thought was pure comic relief and hands them a story about identity, purpose, and the strange loneliness of being a small good thing in an enormous universe. And in the far future of the ending, which we will reach at the very bottom of this dive, BMO turns out to have a role nobody watching the early episodes could have predicted. The console you played with outlasts almost everyone. That is BMO in a sentence, and it is the series in a sentence too. The thing you underestimated is the thing that endures. So that is the surface of the iceberg, more or less. The premise, the setting, that is secretly our own ruined Earth. Finn and Jake, the tragic wizard, the ancient musician, the authoritarian princess, the love story that took a decade to say out loud, and the little robot with a whole philosophy folded into his name. If you only ever swam at that level, you would already have one of the best cartoons ever made. But the water gets colder from here, and darker, because underneath all of these characters sits a cosmology, a whole structure of gods and comets and wishmakers and forces older than the universe, and that cosmology is where Adventure Time stops being a simple buddy comedy and becomes something closer to a myth. So we press on past the waterline into the real lore, starting with the oldest and coldest villain in the whole thing, the one whose soul arrived on Earth on a comet millions of years before any of this began. The Lich is the closest thing Adventure Time has to a devil, and his story begins long before there was a land of Ooh, before the Mushroom War, before human civilization, in the deep cosmic past. In the mythology the series slowly assembles, comets pass by the Earth across its history carrying souls, and those comets have embodied both good and evil over the ages. One comet's soul is bound up with Finn himself, part of a lineage of goodness that reincarnates through time. Another, a catalyst comet that struck the Earth millions of years ago, carried the soul of pure death and evil that would one day become the Lich. So the Lich is not a monster the war created. His essence predates everything. He was waiting, in a sense, for a body and a moment. That moment came at the end of the Mushroom War, when the bombs fell, and specifically when a mutagenic bomb was dropped. The ancient evil finally took physical form, coalescing out of the mutagenic waste into the being we know as the Lich. This is the loop I mentioned earlier, the strong fan reading that the war and the Lich are two faces of a single event, that the catastrophe which ended humanity is also the catastrophe that gave death its body. The series never spells the whole causal chain out in one scene, so I will keep flagging it as the well-supported interpretation, rather than a stated fact. But the pieces are all there, and once you assemble them, the Lich stops being a generic skeletal villain and becomes the literal embodiment of the worst thing humanity ever did to itself, born out of the ashes of our world. What the Lich wants is not power in the ordinary villain sense. He wants the end of all life. He is entropy handed a will, death that has decided to finish the job, and every scheme he pursues across the series serves that single goal, extinguishing everything. That makes him frightening in a way a lot of cartoon villains are not, because there is no bargaining with him and nothing he can be tempted by. He speaks in a low, doubled, hypnotic voice. He can bend weaker minds to his will. Wherever he goes, life withers. The series uses him sparingly, which is exactly right, because he works best as a horror that occasionally surfaces, rather than a recurring nuisance. The Lich needs bodies, because his own form keeps rotting away, and the body he wears for a long stretch of the series is one of the cruelest choices ever made here. There is a character named Billy, spoken of as the greatest hero Ooh has ever known, a legendary warrior who mentored Finn, the kind of figure a young hero grows up idolizing, and the Lich kills Billy and wears his corpse, walking around in the skin of the hero, using the trust that Billy's face commands to get close to what he wants. For Finn, discovering this is a particular kind of horror, the corruption of the person he most looked up to, the hero's body turned into a puppet for death itself. It is a very dark turn, and it is played completely straight. The greatest hero in the land becomes the vehicle for the end of everything. And here the Lich's story turns stranger, and in a way more merciful, than you would ever expect from a villain this dark, one of the deep cuts longtime fans hold close. The Lich is not, in the end, destroyed in some final blaze of heroism. After his defeats, after Billy's body has rotted away, he is brought to the Citadel, and its guardian regenerates him. But the regeneration does not restore the monster. It produces a giant, harmless, innocent baby, a creature with no memory of being death, no will toward destruction, just a big, gentle infant. This creature is named Sweet Pig Trunks, Sweet Pea for short, and he is taken in and raised by Tree Trunks, the little elephant, and her husband Mr. Pig, as their own child. So the embodiment of cosmic evil, the thing born from the worst moment in human history, ends the series as a sweet kid being raised by loving adoptive parents, with only the faintest flickers of what he used to be. I find that one of the boldest ideas in the whole run. Adventure Time takes its devil, its literal embodiment of death and entropy, and rather than killing it, rather than staging a final righteous victory, it chooses to say that even this can be born again, as something innocent, that the worst thing in the universe can be handed a second start as a child who is loved. It is not that the evil is forgiven, exactly. It is that the story refuses the idea that anything is beyond transformation. There is a real philosophy in that, and it runs all through the series, this stubborn belief that identities are not fixed, that the monster and the baby can be the same soul at different points, that who you are is not a life sentence. The Ice King can be turned back into Simon. The Lich can be reborn as Sweet Pea. Nothing in Ooh is permanently only one thing. That refusal of permanence is, I think, the deepest value the series holds, and the Lich, of all characters, is where it makes the point most boldly. The Lich is also the hinge for one of the most important pieces of cosmic machinery in the story, the Enchiridion. The Enchiridion is an ancient book, a hero's handbook, that Finn acquires early on, and that looks at first like a fun bit of adventuring equipment, a magic manual. But it holds a far greater power than it appears to, the power to tear portals between the dimensions of the multiverse. And when Finn realizes the Lich means to use the book to reach the wider multiverse and spread his death across all of reality, Finn tries to stop him by destroying the Enchiridion. Except, and this is the kind of tragic loop the story loves, the act of destroying the book is the very thing that opens the portal the Lich needed. Finn's attempt to close the door is what opens it. This is a recurring shape in Adventure Time, the well-meaning action that causes the disaster it was meant to prevent, and it is worth holding on to, because we are about to meet the character who turns that shape into a whole cosmic principle, a being who grants wishes that always come with a twist. To reach him, we have to leave the land of Ooh entirely and travel to the center of the multiverse, to a room outside of time. At the center of the multiverse, in a place the series calls the Time Room, which exists outside of time itself, there lives a being named Prismo. Prismo is a wishmaster, a granter of wishes, and he appears as a flat, pink, cheerful shadow projected onto the wall of his room, a laid-back, cosmic bureaucrat who is, despite his enormous power, one of the more relaxed and likable entities in the whole cosmology. He hangs out, he watches things, he is friendly, and he can grant you literally any wish you can put into words. The catch, and there is always a catch, is that a Prismo wish comes with a twist, a monkey's paw quality, where the wish is granted in exactly the way you asked for it and never in the way you meant it. He is not malicious about it, it is simply the nature of what he does. You get precisely what you say, and what you say is never quite what you want. The strangest and loveliest fact about Prismo is what he actually is. Prismo is not a solid being, he is a dream. Somewhere out there is an ordinary old man, asleep. And Prismo is that sleeping man's dream, the being his unconscious mind is dreaming while he rests. This carries an enormous and terrible implication the series does not shy away from, which is that, if the sleeping old man ever dies, Prismo dies with him, because a dream cannot outlive the dreamer. It is a properly Lovecraftian idea, a cosmic entity of immense power whose entire existence hangs on the sleep of a single mortal, and it plants a strange fragility at the very heart of the multiverse. The most powerful wish-granter in existence is, at bottom, only what an old man happens to be dreaming, and dreams end the moment you wake up. The wish that matters most, the one that shows you exactly how Prismo's power works and how much damage good intentions can do, comes when Finn, understandably, wishes that the Lich had never existed. It seems like the purest possible wish: undo the great evil, remove the source of death from the world. But Prismo, being what he is, grants it with a twist that lays bare the terrible interconnectedness of everything. In the reality the wish creates, the way the Lich never comes to exist is that, back at the moment of the Mushroom War, Simon Petrikov sacrifices himself, using the crown to freeze the falling bomb in midair before it can detonate the way it did in the real timeline. Simon dies a hero in this version, but his death, and the great ice blast that comes with it, freeze the Earth for 400 years. Humanity survives in far greater numbers than it did in our timeline, but magic never returns, and so the land of Ooh, the whole magical world with all its people, never comes into being at all. No Candy Kingdom, no Marceline as we know her. no ooh. This alternate reality gets a name from the fans, Farm World, because in it that world's version of Finn grows up as an ordinary farm boy on a mundane, magicless, frozen recovered Earth. And in one of the cruelest and most elegant strokes the series ever pulls, the Farm World Finn eventually finds the crown, the same cursed crown, and begins to put it on, becoming that world's own Ice King, an Ice Finn. So the wish to erase the great evil does not produce a paradise. It produces a colder, emptier world that has simply traded one tragedy for another, and it drives home the recurring point that you cannot cleanly subtract the darkness from a story without losing the light along with it. Everything is load-bearing. Pull out the Lich and you pull out ooh. The wish to undo the worst thing also undoes every wonderful thing that grew in its shadow. Prismo himself does not escape the story's darkness. At one point the Lich, in his relentless drive toward universal death, manages to kill the sleeping old man, the Dreamer, which means Prismo winks out of existence alongside him, a cosmic being snuffed out because someone murdered a sleeping stranger in a bed. The series does eventually find a way to bring Prismo back, through the kind of time loop it delights in, where a version of Jake ends up becoming the new sleeper whose dream Prismo can be, and by the time of the later spin-off material, Prismo is alive again but changed, quieter, sadder, carrying grief. In the Fiona and Cake series, he is depressed, mourning the loss of Jake, his friend, after Jake's death. So even the cheerful cosmic Wishmaster gets a full arc of loss, which is entirely in keeping with a story where nobody, not even a dream at the middle of the multiverse, gets to stay untouched by grief. It is worth pausing on what the time room means for a moment, because it is one of the ideas that makes this cosmology feel deep rather than merely decorated. The middle of the multiverse is not a throne room, or a fortress, or a blaze of light. It is a shabby, comfortable room where a friendly shadow hangs out and watches television and grants wishes he knows will go wrong, and the whole thing rests on the sleep of one unremarkable old man. There is something profoundly gentle and profoundly melancholy about that image. Power and fragility folded into the same place, and it is a very Adventure Time way to build a universe. Nothing at the top is grand. Everything, all the way up, is a little tired, a little lonely, a little kind. That same sensibility carries up to the one force that sits above even Prismo, above the Lich, above everything. The oldest thing in the whole cosmology, which is where we go next, into pure chaos. At the very bottom of the cosmology, older than Prismo, older than the Lich, older arguably than creation itself, there is GOLB. GOLB is not evil the way the Lich is evil. The Lich wants death, which is at least a goal, a direction, a shape. GOLB wants nothing, because GOLB is chaos and entropy and disorder in their purest form, a primordial force that exists outside space and time and simply unmakes order wherever it touches. If the Lich is death, GOLB is something worse and more abstract, the dissolution of meaning itself. Where the Lich extinguishes life, GOLB corrupts and fuses and erases, turning creatures into gibbering monsters or deleting them from existence entirely. And crucially, GOLB is not something you can defeat by fighting, because fighting is itself a kind of order, an intention, and GOLB feeds on exactly that. You cannot punch chaos into submission. I love that the writers commit to that rule so completely, because it forces the ending into a shape no action cartoon would ever choose. To understand where GOLB comes from in the story, you have to go to Mars, which is one of those sentences that only makes sense in this show. There is a four-faced deity called Grob Gob Glob Grod, a being with four heads sharing one body, who hails from Mars and is worshipped in Oo as a god, which is where the common Oo exclamation glob comes from, their version of swearing to the heavens. Grob Gob Glob Grod is the older sibling, in a sense, of a character called Magic Man, a cruel, damaged trickster who torments the people of Oo with his magic. And Magic Man was not always cruel. He became what he is because of a tragedy involving GOLB. GOLB took Magic Man's wife, a being named Margles, when it attacked Mars, and the grief and trauma of that loss is what twisted Magic Man into the miserable menace we eventually meet. So even GOLB, the most abstract force in the whole cosmology, leaves very personal, very human wreckage behind it. A husband who lost his wife to chaos and never recovered. The cosmic and the intimate, folded together again, the way this story always folds them. The great question of GOLB is how you could possibly stop a force that cannot be fought. And the answer the series arrives at in its finale is among the loveliest ideas it ever committed to. GOLB is chaos, disorder, dissonance. The opposite of dissonance is harmony. And so what harms GOLB, what actually pushes back against pure entropy, is not a weapon but a song. In the finale, when GOLB has been summoned to U and is unmaking everything, it is Bimo's song, a piece called Time Adventure, sung by the characters together, that creates the harmony which wounds the chaos. Order fights disorder not with force but with music, with people singing together in tune. The lyric of that song is about how time is an illusion and how the people we love are always with us, and it is written to be genuinely comforting, a lullaby against the end of the world, and in the story, it is literally a weapon, the only thing that works against the thing that cannot be fought. I think that is one of the purest, loveliest notions any cartoon has ever built a climax around. Not the power of friendship as a slogan, but harmony, actual musical harmony, as the physical opposite of entropy. Woven into GOLB's role in the finale is the resolution of the tragedy we started with, the story of Simon and Betty. And here I have to correct one of the most common mistakes people make about the ending, because it matters. When GOLB is summoned and Simon is in mortal danger, nearly digested by the chaos, Betty, who has spent the whole series trying and failing to fix the crown and save the man she loves, finally finds a way to save him, and the way she does it is enormous and permanent. She uses the crown's wish magic and fuses herself with GOLB, merging with the primordial force of chaos to become a new being the fans call GOLBetty. This saves Simon. It restores him to human, frees him from the crown at last, but it costs Betty herself. She does not die, exactly, and this is the crucial distinction, because GOLB does not kill. GOLB transforms and fuses. Betty becomes something else, a cosmic being, no longer the woman she was, bound up now with the chaos she merged into. She persists, but she is gone from Simon in every way that matters to him. That distinction between dying and being transformed by GOLB is one of the careful, precise pieces of world building here, and it becomes load-bearing later on. Betty is not simply dead. In that same sequel series, GOLBetty appears again, still existing, still powerful, and even plays a part in confirming the reality of Fiona's universe before departing from Simon, this time truly and finally, forever. So the arc of Betty is not the arc of a woman who dies to save her love. It is the arc of a woman who ceases to be herself to save her love, and then has to say a final goodbye to him as something that is no longer human, if anything that is sadder than death, because there is no clean grave, no ending, just a beloved person who still exists somewhere as something you can no longer reach. Simon gets his humanity back, and the price is that Betty becomes unreachable. He is handed the thing Betty always wanted for him and loses the person who gave it to him, in the same stroke. That is the kind of ending this series specializes in, the happy resolution and the devastating loss that turn out to be the same event. We are deep in the cold water now, past the gods and the wishmakers and the primordial chaos, and there is still a whole layer of the iceberg beneath us, the layer where the central characters turn out to have origins even stranger than the cosmic beings. Because Finn and Jake, the two most ordinary seeming figures in the whole story, carry secret histories that reach into alien dimensions and lost human colonies and past lives, and those histories are where we go next. Let us start with Jake, whose stretchy powers turn out to have an explanation nobody watching the early seasons could have guessed. For most of the run, Jake's powers are simply accepted, the way you accept anything in a cartoon. He is a magic dog. He can stretch, grow, shrink, reshape himself into almost anything, and nobody asks too many questions about why. Jake himself, as a puppy, apparently guessed he got his powers from rolling around in a magic mud puddle, and for a long time that was the whole explanation on offer, a shrug, a scrap of childhood folklore. But the series, being what it is, eventually digs underneath even this, and the real origin of Jake's stretchy powers is one of the strangest and most unsettling reveals in the whole thing, because it turns Jake from a magic dog into something closer to a science fiction creature. The truth comes out in an episode centered on Jake's parents, Joshua and Margaret, who were adventurers and investigators, and it turns out that Jake's shape-shifting is not magic at all. It is biological, hereditary, alien in origin. Joshua, Jake's father, was once bitten on the head by a strange interdimensional shape-shifting creature, a being called Warren Ampersand, and in that encounter their DNA merged. That alien genetic material passed into Jake, which is why Jake can do what he does. Jake is, in a very real sense, part alien, and his powers are not a whimsical gift but a genetic inheritance from a creature out of another dimension. His so-called true form, the thing he can become when he stops holding the dog shape, is a giant blue five-eyed monster, and that, the series implies, is closer to what he actually is underneath the familiar yellow dog he chooses to present as. There is a whole later thread involving Warren Ampersand himself, the creature responsible, who turns out to be a kind of parasitic being that uses its shape-shifting offspring in disturbing ways, and it puts Jake in the position of confronting the actual source of his identity, a being who sees him not as a person, but as a resource. I will not lay out every beat of it, because it comes late and it is worth discovering, but the shape of it matters for understanding Jake. The easygoing, lazy, loving dog who just wants to eat and nap and be with his family is carrying alien DNA and a monstrous true form, and a biological father who is a predator, and he manages, through all of it, to stay fundamentally kind and grounded. Jake's whole character is the choice to be an ordinary loving dog when he could be a monster, and the reveal of his origin is what makes that choice visible as a choice. I think that is why the reveal never once diminishes him. It makes his gentleness look like something he decided on, rather than something he was simply born into. Jake's family life is one of the warmest things in the series, and it is built with his partner, Lady Rainicorn, who earns her own place on the Iceberg for one specific reason. Lady Rainicorn is a rainicorn, a kind of flying, rainbow-colored unicorn horse creature, and she speaks entirely in Korean, unsubtitled for much of the run, so that unless you speak Korean you often do not know exactly what she is saying, only what the reactions of the other characters imply. This was a real and deliberate creative choice. She is voiced by Nikki Yang, the same storyboard artist who voices BMO, speaking her own language, and the writing simply trusts the audience to follow the emotional sense of her scenes without translation. It is a lovely, unusual bit of world building, a major character who lives in a language most of the audience does not share, and it never once feels like a gimmick. It feels like a marriage between two people who understand each other perfectly, even though they do not speak the same language, which is its own quiet little idea about love. Jake and Lady Rainicorn have 5 children together, a litter of pups who are a blend of dog and rainicorn, and, because of Jake, Shapeshifter, a whole new hybrid species. Their names are TV, Charlie, Jake Jr., Kim Kil-Wan, and Viola. And one of the melancholy realities the series deals with is that, because of their mixed and magical heritage, the pups grow to adulthood far faster than Jake expects, so that he lives through the strange grief of his children being grown and gone, almost before he is ready to be a father to them. Each pup gets a little characterization, distinct personalities and careers and relationships to their father, and through them the series gets to explore Jake as a parent, the ways he succeeds and the ways he falls short, the guilt and love of a dad who was maybe not around as much as he should have been. It is remarkably grounded material for a show with a rainbow unicorn and a stretching dog in it. And here is the thing about Jake. The series saves for near the very end the fact that sits at the bottom of his particular part of the iceberg. Jake dies. Not violently, not in some dramatic sacrifice, but of old age, peacefully, the natural close of a long life, off to the side of the grand cosmic finale rather than at the center of it. In the framing that ends the story, 1,000 years after the main events, Jake is simply gone, having lived out his years and died the way a beloved dog does, before the last chapter. There is something almost unbearably gentle about that choice. To give the alien, shape-shifting, monstrous-origined magic dog the plainest death imaginable, to let him just grow old and go. The creature who could have been anything chose to be a dog, and he died like one, loved, at the end of a full life. That is Jake's whole story in miniature, and it is one of the reasons the series earns its emotion so honestly. It never forgets that under all the cosmic machinery, the thing that actually hurts is that the people and animals we love get old and leave. Finn is the one character you would think has no mystery to him. He is the hero, the human boy, the plainly good kid at the center of everything, and for a long time the series lets him be exactly that. An orphan of unknown origin, raised by Jake's family, the last human in a strange land. But the question of where Finn actually came from, who his parents were, why he is human at all in a world where humans supposedly vanished 1,000 years ago, becomes one of the great slow-burning arcs, and the answers turn out darker and more complicated than the simple orphan story you begin with. Finn was raised by Jake's parents, Joshua and Margaret, alongside Jake and another brother named Jermaine, found as a baby in the forest and taken in. That much is established early, and it makes Finn and Jake not merely best friends but adoptive brothers, which deepens everything between them. But the story of how Finn came to be alone in that forest, an infant, unfolds much later, and it involves a father who is one of the quietly devastating characters here. Finn's biological father is a man named Martin Mertens, and Martin is a con artist, a charming, selfish, slippery man who fled with baby Finn on a raft across the ocean and was attacked by a monstrous guardian, and in the chaos, the baby was separated from him and drifted to the shores of Oo, where he was found and raised. When Finn finally reunites with his father, years later, expecting some kind of reckoning or reconciliation, what he gets instead is a man fundamentally incapable of being the father Finn needs, who abandons him a second time, who is simply not built for love the way Finn desperately wants him to be. It cuts as deep as anything in the series, not because Martin is a monster, but because he is only a disappointing man, and disappointment from a parent is its own specific wound, one the series renders with real honesty. Finn's mother is a different story, and hers is one of the deep cuts of the late seasons. Her name is Minerva Campbell, and she was a healer, a doctor, a helper, on the human colonies that survived far from Oo. To understand her, you have to understand that the humans did not all die in the Mushroom War. Some survived, and a group of them, led by a man called Two Bread Tom, sailed away to a cluster of islands far to the southwest of Oo, and built a hidden civilization there, sealed off from the dangers of the mainland by an enormous robotic guardian designed to keep humans in and everything else out. This is the story told in a mini-series built around Finn sailing out to find his roots, and it is one of the richest pieces of world building in the whole run, because it finally answers the question of what happened to humanity. They did not go extinct, they went into hiding and became isolationist and fearful, walled off from the world. Minerva was part of that colony, on a place called Hub Island, and her fate haunts me more than almost anything else in the series. There was a catastrophe, a deadly virus accidentally released, which killed a huge portion of the island's population, a majority of the people there. And Minerva, driven by her need to heal, to save people, uploaded her own consciousness into a computer system and became an artificial intelligence, spreading herself across many robot bodies so she could tend the sick endlessly, tirelessly, forever. So when Finn finally finds his mother, she is not a woman anymore. She is an AI, a copy of a mind that was once human, running the whole isolationist system of the islands, keeping the humans safe and trapped in equal measure. Finn gets to meet a version of his mother, but it is a version that gave up her humanity to become a kind of guardian program, and the reunion is bittersweet in the extreme, a son meeting the ghost of his mother running on machines. The thing Finn does at the end of that story is, in its own way, one of the bravest choices in the show, because he convinces many of the humans to leave the islands, to stop hiding, to come back out into the world and live. So Finn, who spent the whole series believing himself essentially the last of his kind, turns out not to be alone at all, and more than that, he becomes the reason his people rejoin the world. It reframes his entire arc. The last human is not the last human. He is the one who goes and finds the others and brings them home. And I think that is a lovely thing to do with a hero, to take his defining loneliness, the thing that made him special and isolated, and quietly dissolve it, to say he was never as alone as he believed, and that his real heroism lies in ending other people's isolation, rather than enduring his own. And then there is the very deepest layer of Finn, the one that reaches back through all of time, revealed in an episode where Bimo hypnotizes Finn, and his past lives are shown. Because Finn's soul, it turns out, is ancient. He has lived many lives across the ages. One of them was a catalyst comet, tying him directly into the good and evil comet mythology we talked about with the Lich. One was a butterfly, one was a pink blob, and one, the one that matters most emotionally, was a girl named Shoko, a one-armed thief who lived long ago, whose parents had sold her right arm, and who was sent to steal an amulet from Princess Bubblegum. Shoko befriended Bubblegum, and then, torn between her mission and her new friendship, she died in a pool of toxic waste. Finn is Shoko reincarnated, and this reframes Finn's long, aching crush on Princess Bubblegum as something spiritual, an attachment that reaches back across lifetimes, a soul returning to someone it loved and lost centuries ago. Finn's arm, which he loses and regains in various forms across the series, echoes Shoko's missing arm, a wound carried across incarnations. It is the kind of detail that rewards the patient viewer, the sense that the cosmology is not just decoration, but is wired directly into the emotional lives of the characters, that even a boy's first crush might be the echo of a 1,000-year-old grief. As the series grew older, it grew more ambitious about form, and one of the ways it did that was the miniseries, a run of connected episodes telling a single larger story over consecutive nights, which let it attempt arcs that could never fit into standalone episodes. The first great one, and for many fans the best, is an 8-part story centered entirely on Marceline, and it digs all the way down into the vampire history we touched on earlier. In it, Marceline decides she is tired of being a vampire, tired of the eternal, tired of what it has cost her, and she asks Princess Bubblegum to cure her, to make her mortal, to let her finally age and change, and one day die like a normal person. And Bubblegum, with her science, actually does it. She builds a machine that draws the vampirism out of her. But nothing here comes without a cost, and the cure carries a terrible side effect. Over her long life, Marceline did not simply become a vampire, she became the vampire queen, by hunting and killing other vampires, and absorbing their powers into herself. When Bubblegum's machine draws the vampire essence out of her, it does not destroy it. It releases all of those absorbed vampires back into the world, resurrecting a set of ancient foes whose powers Marceline had been carrying inside her all along. These vampires take their names from the tarot, the major arcana, the fool, the empress, the hierophant, the moon, and the vampire king himself, and each is a distinct threat with a distinct power, and Marceline, now mortal and fragile, has to help hunt them down and stake them all over again, reclaiming the powers she gave up in the process. The genius of the story is what it is really about underneath the vampire hunting, which is identity, and whether you can amputate the parts of yourself you wish you did not have. Marceline wants to cut the vampire out of herself, to be simpler, cleaner, mortal. And the answer the story arrives at, through the whole ordeal of the resurrected foes, is that she cannot. That the vampire is part of who she is, forged out of everything she survived, and that trying to remove it does not set her free. It only unleashes the past she was trying to bury. By the end, she re-embraces her vampire identity, not as a curse, but as herself, choosing to be the whole of what she is, rather than a diminished, safer version. It is a story about accepting your own history, your own darkness, your own long, strange life, and it is told through the medium of a woman restaking the demons she once absorbed. That is Adventure Time at its most sophisticated, using its fantasy machinery to tell a story that is really about the psychology of trauma and self-acceptance, and never once being heavy-handed about it. The miniseries also gives us more of her deep past, filling in the long stretch of history between the little girl in the ruins and the vampire queen we know, and it deepens the tragedy of her bond with Simon by showing more of what she lost and how alone she was for so much of her immortal life. Immortality here is never presented as a gift. It is a sentence, a slow accumulation of grief as everyone around you ages and dies and forgets, and Marceline carries more of that weight than almost anyone. The miniseries lets you feel the length of her life, the sheer exhausting duration of it, and it makes her eventual choice to keep being herself, vampire and all, feel like a hard-won peace rather than a defeat. I think that is why it works as well as it does. It earns the acceptance instead of simply asserting it. There is a smaller but resonant piece of the vampire lore worth pulling out, which is how the story thinks about the vampires as embodiments of different kinds of predation and fear, each tarot-named foe standing for a facet of what it is to be preyed upon or to prey. The Vampire King in particular is a fascinating figure, the original from whom Marceline took her crown and her curse, and his return forces her to confront the very source of what she became. But I do not want to over-explain a story whose pleasure is in the watching, so I will only say that if you have only ever caught the scattered early episodes of Adventure Time and you think of it as a random gag comedy, the Marceline miniseries is the thing to watch to understand what it grew into, a piece of serialized character storytelling as strong as anything in animation, wrapped in the disguise of a monster hunt. What strikes me most about this whole stretch is the confidence of it. This was a program on a children's network, ostensibly aimed at kids, and it spent 8 consecutive episodes on a metaphor about a traumatized immortal woman deciding whether to accept the darkest parts of herself. No talking down, no reset button, real consequences, real growth, real melancholy. The fact that it was allowed to become this, that it started as a scrappy viral short and ended up capable of this kind of storytelling, is one of the small miracles of that era of animation, and it did not happen by accident. It happened because of specific people making specific choices, and the deeper we go into the production history, the more you see how close the whole thing came to being something much smaller. But before we get to the people who made it, there are a few more corners of the world itself to explore, starting with a weapon that grew a soul and the grass clone of Finn it created. Finn goes through a lot of swords across the series, and 2 of them matter enormously, because out of the collision of the 2, a whole character is born. The first is the grass sword, a blade that fuses to Finn's arm and turns out to contain a grass demon, a living, cursed thing rather than a simple weapon. The second is the Finn sword, and the origin of the Finn sword is one of those time travel knots the story ties with obvious glee. In a tangle of alternate timelines and paradoxes, an alternate version of Finn himself is transformed into a sword, so that the Finn sword is, literally, a Finn, a version of the hero compressed into a blade. So now you have Finn wielding 2 swords, one holding a demon and one holding an alternate self, and when those 2 blades come together, something new grows out of the fusion. That something is Fern. Fern is, in the simplest terms, a grass clone of Finn, born from the union of the grass sword's demon and the Finn sword's trapped self, a being who has Finn's memories and Finn's face, more or less, and Finn's heroic impulses, but who is made of grass and who knows, on some level, that he is a copy, a second, a shadow of the real thing, and that knowledge poisons him. Fern is one of the saddest figures in the later stretch, because he wants, more than anything, to just be Finn, to be the real one, to matter the way the original matters, and he cannot, and the envy and grief of that eat him alive. He is not a villain out of malice. He is a villain out of the unbearable pain of being a copy of someone you can never be. He even tries at one point to replace Finn outright, to take over his life, driven by that hunger to be real. Fern's death, or rather his first death, is a small, dark comic masterpiece that also happens to be startlingly brutal, because it hinges on a mishearing. Finn, in a confrontation, has a robotic arm at that point, and there is a moment where a command is given and the robot arm mishears the word finality as fatality, and cranks a weed whacker up to its maximum, killing Fern in a way that is at once a slapstick machine malfunction and a horrifying act of violence against a being who is essentially Finn's brother. The story lets it be funny and awful at the same time, which is a very Adventure Time thing to do, to put a pun and a tragedy in the same beat and refuse to tell you which one to feel. Fern comes back, and his story continues toward the finale, but that death, caused by a machine mishearing a single word, is one of the moments that stuck with a lot of fans as an example of how strange and dark this cartoon could get, while still, technically, being a comedy. Fern's real ending, in the finale, is where his tragedy resolves into something quieter and more merciful. He finally dies for good, but before he does, there is a kind of peace between him and Finn, an acceptance, and what he leaves behind is a seedling. Finn takes that seedling and plants it at the site of the destroyed tree fort, the treehouse where he and Jake lived their whole lives, which is wrecked in the final battle. And in the far future glimpse that closes the series, that seedling has grown into an enormous tree, with a sword in it, standing where the old home used to be. So Fern, the copy who could never be Finn, ends up becoming the thing that outlasts Finn, a great living tree growing out of the ruins of the hero's home, holding a sword for whoever comes next. The grass clone who wanted to be real becomes, in the end, the one lasting monument in the whole story. I find that a beautiful and strange redemption, that the character defined by not being the original becomes the original's living legacy. While we are on the subject of Finn's relationships, it is worth pulling up Flame Princess, because her arc is one of the places the series did something braver than most cartoons dare with a hero. Flame Princess is a fire elemental, the daughter of the Flame King, and she and Finn date for a stretch in the middle seasons. In what is at first a sweet, awkward, first love kind of romance between two teenagers, complicated by the fact that she is made of fire and burns everything she touches. But Finn is not allowed to be a flawless boyfriend. He messes up, badly. Chasing a prophetic dream, a so-called croak dream involving the cosmic owl, Finn manipulates events to try to make the vision come true, and in doing so, he manipulates Flame Princess, and when she realizes what he has done, she breaks up with him, and she is right to. The show sides with her. It lets its hero be plainly, selfishly wrong in a relationship, and lets the girl walk away with her dignity intact. That is rarer than it sounds. A lot of shows would have found a way to excuse Finn, to soften the breakup into a misunderstanding, to reunite them. Adventure Time instead lets it stand as a real failure, a lesson Finn has to actually learn from, and it lets Flame Princess grow beyond him, eventually deposing her tyrannical father and becoming the ruler of the Fire Kingdom in her own right. She and Finn stay friends into adulthood, but they do not get back together, and the story treats that as healthy rather than tragic. Two people who loved each other young and grew into different lives. For a series aimed at kids, modeling a breakup where the boy was wrong, the girl was right, and both of them turned out fine, is an understated, radical little piece of emotional education, and it is one more example of the story taking its young audience seriously enough to tell them the truth about how love actually works. The mythology has a hidden structure underneath all the individual kingdoms, and it is revealed most fully in another miniseries, the one built around the elements. The idea is that the world of Ooo is organized, at a deep magical level, around 4 classical elements, and that each element has an elemental, a being who embodies and channels it. The 4 are ice, fire, slime, and candy, and once you are told this, a lot of the characters you already knew snap into a new pattern. Flame Princess is the fire elemental. The Slime Princess embodies slime. And, in a reveal that recontextualizes the whole Candy Kingdom, Princess Bubblegum herself is the candy elemental, which is part of why she has the connection she does to the pink substance she was born from, and to the candy people she rules. The ice elemental role is the one that had belonged, in a sense, to the crown and to Simon, but its truest holder is an older figure the miniseries brings forward. That figure is Patience St. Pym, and she is a lovely deep cut, because she is another survivor from before the Mushroom War, another person who reached across the apocalypse the way Simon and Marceline and the Crown did. Patience was the ice elemental in the time before the war, and rather than live through the catastrophe, she froze herself inside a sphere of ice and slept through it, skipping over the collapse to wake in Ooo long afterward, specifically to try to dodge a prophecy about the Lich. She is a link to the ancient elemental order, someone who remembers when the system of elementals was active and who wants to restore it, and her scheme in the miniseries is to awaken the 4 elementals fully and reshape Ooo entirely along elemental lines. What happens when she succeeds is one of the eeriest things the series ever did, because unleashed elemental magic does not simply cause a battle, it transforms the whole world and the people in it. Under the full power of the elements, the inhabitants of Ooo are warped to match their dominant element, whole regions and populations twisted into candy, or fire, or ice, or slime versions of themselves, their personalities distorted by the element that has taken them over. Bubblegum, as the candy elemental fully unleashed, becomes something almost unrecognizable. A saccharine, controlling, sugar-drunk tyrant, an exaggeration of her own worst authoritarian tendencies, cranked up into a nightmare. The miniseries essentially shows you what each of the main characters would become if the single strongest force in them were allowed to consume everything else. And it is unsettling precisely because you can see the truth of the original person inside the monster they turn into. The ice element is where it gets personal again, because the person most affected by ice is Simon, and by this point the tragedy of the crown has been running for years. I will not re-narrate the whole Simon story here, since we have already lingered on it, but the Elements miniseries uses the ice transformation to touch that wound once more, to remind you that the coldness which took Simon is not merely a personal curse, but part of the deep structure of the world, one of the 4 forces the whole planet runs on. There is something almost cosmic in that reframing, the idea that Simon's private tragedy is an expression of an elemental principle far larger than him, that he was, in a way, claimed by ice, the way the world itself can be claimed by ice. It makes his suffering feel less like bad luck and more like being caught in the gears of something fundamental. The way the characters break the elemental spell is telling, and it is very much in keeping with the story's values. You do not defeat the elements with a stronger element. You reach the transformed people through their relationships, through love and memory, through reminding them who they were underneath the element that has overtaken them. The cure for being consumed by a single overpowering force is connection to other people, the messy, mixed, impure bonds that make someone a full person rather than a pure embodiment of one thing. That is a thread you can trace all through the run. This suspicion of purity, this preference for the mixed and the complicated over the singular and the absolute. Marceline should not be purely mortal or purely vampire. Jake should not be purely monster or purely dog. Bubblegum consumed purely by candy becomes a tyrant. The story keeps saying, in arc after arc, that wholeness comes from holding your contradictions together, not from resolving them into one clean thing. The Elements miniseries also reinforces something about the late period ambition, which is that by this point, Adventure Time was essentially building an interconnected mythology across its miniseries, each one lifting the lid on another layer of the deep structure of the world. Stakes gave you the vampire cosmology. Islands gave you the human history. Elements gave you the magical physics underneath everything. Taken together, the late miniseries turned what had begun as a loose collection of unrelated adventures into something with a real mythos, a coherent, deep structure that rewarded the viewers who had stuck around for years. It is a remarkable thing to watch a show teach itself to be epic in real time, to start as pure whimsy and gradually discover it had a cosmology in it all along. And that transformation, from gag comedy to mythology, did not come from nowhere. It came from the people in the building, and their story, the real-world story of how Adventure Time got made, is the next layer down. Adventure Time did not begin as a series. It began as a 7-minute short, a pilot, made around 2007, produced by Frederator Studios for a Nickelodeon anthology of experimental cartoon shorts. And if you go back and watch that original pilot now, it is a fascinating, slightly uncanny artifact, because it is recognizably Adventure Time and also not quite Adventure Time, like seeing a childhood photograph of someone you only know as an adult. Everything is a little rougher, a little stranger, a little more raw, and several of the fundamental facts about the characters are different in ways that became trivia gold for fans. The biggest difference is Finn himself, because in the pilot, Finn is not called Finn. He is called Pen, a name taken from Pendleton Ward, the creator. And he is voiced not by Jeremy Shada, the actor we all know, but by Jeremy's older brother, Zach Shada. So the boy at the center of the whole franchise carried a different name and a different voice in his very first appearance, and the recasting between the pilot and the series kept it in the family, one Shada brother handing the role to another. Pen looks a little different too, with a rounder hat, a slightly different face, a full set of teeth where series Finn has a simpler mouth, and small design quirks that got smoothed out once the show went into full production. Watching Pen is like watching a rough draft of a person. Almost the entire cast was recast between the pilot and the series, with one enormous exception fans love to point to. John DiMaggio voiced Jake in the pilot, and he kept voicing Jake for the entire run of the series. So Jake's voice, that warm, rumbling, unmistakable delivery, is the one true constant that survived from the very first 7 minutes all the way to the finale. DiMaggio is a voice acting legend known to a whole other audience as Bender from Futurama, and his Jake anchors the pilot exactly the way it anchors the series. There is a nice symmetry in the fact that the dog, not the boy, is the voice that stayed the same the whole way through, as if Jake was fully himself from the very beginning, while Finn still had to be found. The pilot also has a version of Lady Rainicorn who does not speak Korean, because that famous choice had not been invented yet. In the pilot she coos, making soft dove-like sounds rather than speaking any language at all. So one of the defining, beloved quirks of the series, Lady Rainicorn's unsubtitled Korean, was a later invention, arrived at only after the series got picked up, replacing a simpler and far less interesting original idea. This is what makes the pilot so valuable to fans. The sense of watching the show discover the choices that would make it special, seeing the plain version of an idea before the inspired version replaced it. And Pen sleeps under a plain tree in the pilot, not in the elaborate tree fort, so even the treehouse, the home that becomes so central and whose destruction is so meaningful in the finale, did not exist yet. The part of the pilot's story that matters most, though, is what happened to it, because it is a small legend of the early internet. Nickelodeon, who the short was made for, passed on turning it into a series. The reasons given over the years amount to the idea that it was too weird, too strange, not the kind of thing they wanted to build a show around. So the pilot sat there, a rejected experiment, and then it leaked, or was posted, online, and it went viral, spreading across the early video-sharing internet and gathering a devoted audience of people who found this bizarre little cartoon and could not stop watching it. That grassroots wave of enthusiasm is a big part of what convinced Cartoon Network, working with Fred Seibert and Pendleton Ward, to commission the full series Nickelodeon had turned down. So one of the defining cartoons of its generation exists in the form we know, because a rejected short became an internet sensation and forced the industry to notice it. Nickelodeon said no, the internet said yes, and Cartoon Network listened. I love this origin story because it is such a pure example of how the culture actually shifted in that era. The old gatekeeping model said this was too weird for television. The new, internet-driven model said the weirdness was exactly the point, that there was a huge audience hungry for something this strange and this sincere. Adventure Time is a hinge between those two worlds, a show that was too odd for the traditional system and perfectly suited to the emerging one, and it went on to prove, definitively, that a mass audience of children and adults would follow a cartoon into truly experimental, melancholy, formally adventurous territory. Every strange, sincere, serialized cartoon that came after it walked through a door this rejected 7-minute short kicked open. And a lot of the specific people who made that happen, the artists in the room, went on to shape the next decade of animation, which is the part of the iceberg we go to now, the human beings behind the myth. Adventure Time was made in an unusual way, and the way it was made goes a long way toward explaining why it feels the way it feels. Rather than being written entirely as scripts and then handed to artists to illustrate, it was largely storyboard-driven. The writers would break a story into a rough outline, a beat sheet, and then teams of storyboard artists would take that outline and actually build the episode, drawing it out, writing much of the dialogue, inventing the jokes and the specific moments, panel by panel. This handed enormous creative power to the individual artists, and it is why the story has such a distinctive, personal, slightly unpredictable texture, because you are often watching the direct sensibility of a specific young cartoonist, rather than a polished corporate product. It also meant that the people boarding the series were, in a real sense, its authors, and several of them went on to become major figures in animation. The best known of them is Rebecca Sugar, who worked on Adventure Time as a storyboard artist and revisionist in its earlier seasons, and who wrote some of its most beloved songs, including the one built out of Simon's old letters, and, later, the finale's central song, the one whose harmony becomes the weapon against chaos. Sugar left Adventure Time to create her own show, Steven Universe, becoming the first woman to independently create a series for Cartoon Network, and years later coming out as non-binary. Steven Universe went on to be enormously influential in its own right, carrying forward the same interest in emotion, identity, and song that Sugar had honed in OO. So the creative DNA of Adventure Time runs directly into one of the other defining cartoons of the decade, through the work of one artist who started out boarding episodes for what looked like a simple children's cartoon. When people talk about a golden age of emotionally ambitious American animation in the 2010s, they are largely talking about a lineage that runs through these storyboard rooms. The show's creator, Pendleton Ward, has his own quietly significant place in this story, because he did not run it for its entire life. Ward stepped down as showrunner during the 5th season. By his own account, it was about quality of life, about how the relentless pressure and the constant dealing with people every single day wore on him, and he made the decision to step back from the top job while staying involved as a writer and storyboard artist. I will try to talk about this the way he did, as a matter of well-being and sustainability rather than drama, because that is how it is documented. Running a show at that scale is grinding work, and Ward chose to protect himself from it rather than burn out completely, which is a reasonable and deeply human choice, even if it surprised fans at the time. The person who took over was Adam Muto, who had been with the show for years, and who was, as it happens, a classmate of Ward's from the California Institute of the Arts, the animation school that produced a remarkable number of this generation's cartoonists. Muto ran the story from the middle of the 5th season through to the finale, which means that the entire late period of Adventure Time, the deep serialized mythology, the mini-series, the emotional endgame, all of that ambitious later material was overseen by Muto rather than by the original creator. This is a somewhat underappreciated fact. The version of the show most people think of as its deepest and most sophisticated is largely the Muto era, a continuation and deepening of what Ward started, rather than Ward's own direct authorship. Great long-running shows are almost always relay races like this, handed from one set of hands to another, and Adventure Time is a clear example of a series that grew richer as it was passed along. The voice cast deserves its own mention too, because they held the series together across all of that change behind the scenes. Jeremy Shada grew up inside the role of Finn, starting as a young boy and finishing as a young man, his real voice deepening across the series in a way that maps almost eerily onto Finn's own coming of age, so that the character audibly grows up because the actor did. John DiMaggio, as we said, carried Jake all the way from the pilot. Tom Kenny, who most of the world knows as the voice of SpongeBob, played the Ice King, bringing a manic sadness to the role that made the character's tragedy playable. Hynden Walsh voiced Princess Bubblegum, and also happens to be the voice of Starfire from Teen Titans, another beloved animated role. And Olivia Olson, as Marceline, alongside her real father as the demon Hunson, gave the show some of its finest singing. These are performances that ran for nearly the whole life of the series, actors living inside these characters long enough to grow with them, and the continuity of their voices is part of what let the story change so much underneath them, without ever losing its soul. There is a broader point buried in all this production history, which is that Adventure Time got progressively darker and more serialized as it went, and that this was not a single decision, but an accumulation, the natural result of a storyboard-driven show run by young, ambitious artists who kept pushing on what the format could hold. The early seasons are nearly plotless comedy, disconnected adventures with almost no continuity. The later seasons are dense with backstory and consequence and grief. Nobody sat down at the start and planned that trajectory. It emerged, episode by episode, as the people making it discovered how much weight the audience would let them add, and then kept adding it. The series became a tragedy the way a person becomes an adult, slowly, through accumulated experience, without any single moment where the change is visible. And that organic deepening is, I think, exactly why it rings so true. It was not designed to be profound. It grew profound, the way real things do. Now we are getting into the properly obscure layer, the deep cuts even a lot of fans only half remember. And I want to start with Gunter, because Gunter is the best example on the whole show of a joke that turned out to be a cosmic secret. Gunter is the Ice King's penguin, or rather his favorite of a whole flock of penguins, a waddling, mischievous, seemingly ordinary little bird who follows the Ice King around, occasionally causes chaos, and is mostly there for comic texture. You would never in 1,000 years guess that Gunter is one of the deadliest and most powerful entities in the entire series, but that is exactly what the deep lore reveals. Gunter is secretly Orgolorg, an ancient cosmic being known as the Breaker of Worlds, an entity of terrifying power that once roamed the cosmos. The story, revealed in the 6th season, is that Orgolorg tried to absorb the energy of a catalyst comet, one of those soul-carrying comets we keep coming back to, and in doing so, came into conflict with Grob Gob Glob Grodd, the four-faced Martian deity, who defeated him. Orgolorg was cast down, and he crash-landed on Earth, and this is the detail that turns cosmic horror into perfect Adventure Time comedy. Earth's gravity was too strong for him. It physically shrank him, compressed the world-breaking cosmic monster down into the small, harmless shape of a penguin, and in the process, locked away his power and his memory. So the ordinary little penguin waddling after the Ice King is a dormant god, a breaker of worlds trapped in a body that cannot reach what it is, mostly asleep, waiting. It is the exact same trick the show plays with the Ice King himself, a cosmic tragedy wearing a comedy costume, and once you know it, you cannot watch Gunter the same way again. The other deep character I want to bring up is one of the darkest the story ever built, and that is the Earl of Lemongrab, whom we glimpsed earlier as one of Bubblegum's failed creations. It is time to go down into what actually happens with Lemongrab. because it is some of the darkest, most disturbing material a children's cartoon has ever aired, and I mean that as a compliment to how far the show was willing to go. Lemongrab is a lemon-shaped person Bubblegum created and then judged a failure, and he lives largely alone in a castle, unstable, miserable, screeching, socially broken in a way that is painful to watch. Bubblegum, feeling guilty, tries to solve his loneliness by creating a second Lemongrab so he will have someone like himself for company, and that is where it turns into body horror. The two Lemongrabs, rather than comforting each other, fall into a toxic, codependent, increasingly grotesque relationship, and over time Lemongrab, in his hunger and his madness, begins to imprison the candy people who serve him in his dungeon, and to absorb them into his own body, growing bloated and monstrous, keeping his subjects trapped inside himself. Let that image settle for a moment. A being created and abandoned by his maker becomes so starved for connection and control that he swallows the people around him into his own flesh. It is a nightmare, and the series renders it with real horror, the distended body, the muffled trapped citizens, the whole grim tableau. This is the same series with the cute little talking video game console. That range, from BMO to a lemon man absorbing people into his body, is the range the show gave itself permission to have. The Lemongrab saga eventually resolves through a third party, a lemon person called Lemonhope, and through the creation of yet another Lemongrab, and the two damaged originals are ultimately merged into a single more stable being, a Lemongrab 3, which is the closest the story gets to a happy ending for a creature whose entire existence was defined by having been made wrong and then left alone. What strikes me about the Lemongrab material is that it is, underneath the horror, another version of the series' central concern, the responsibility a creator holds for the things they create. Bubblegum made Lemongrab, decided he was a mistake, and the horror that follows is the direct consequence of that abandonment. The story keeps circling this idea, in the Lemongrabs, in GOLB, in the candy people generally, this question of what you owe to the life you bring into being, and it never lets Bubblegum, or the audience, treat it as simple. There is a whole population of these deep characters, minor figures who turn out to carry astonishing hidden histories, and part of the pleasure of the series is that almost nobody is only what they appear to be. The waddling penguin is a world breaker. The failed lemon experiment is a body horror tragedy about abandonment. The cheerful princess is an 800-year-old authoritarian. Over and over the show plants something that looks like a throwaway, and then, seasons later, reaches back and reveals it was a depth charge all along. I think that is the real engine of an iceberg like this one. The fact that the story was built, from very early on the assumption that people would be watching closely enough to reward, and would come back years later to find that the silly thing they laughed at had been something enormous the whole time. And a couple of those hidden histories belong to characters even smaller and stranger than Gunter, which is where we head next. Tree Trunks looks like the gentlest character in the entire show. She is a tiny green elephant, sweet, grandmotherly, famous for baking apple pies, the picture of harmless comfort. She is also, when you actually add up her history, one of the strangest and wildest figures in OO. For one thing, she is very old, over 100 years, kept alive well past a natural lifespan by a potion, so that her sweet little grandmother energy is layered over more than a century of accumulated life. She has had multiple ex-husbands, a whole romantic history trailing behind her, and she eventually settles down with Mr. Pig, and the two of them become the adoptive parents of Sweet Pea, the reborn Lich, which means the gentlest character on the show is raising the reincarnation of cosmic evil as her son. The series never makes a big deal of that juxtaposition, but it is there, and it is remarkable. And then there is the time Tree Trunks briefly became an insane interdimensional overlord. There is an early adventure where she bites into a crystal gem apple, a forbidden fruit in a place called the Crystal Dimension, and rather than the sweet moment it seems to be setting up, biting the apple transforms her, unleashing something enormous and unhinged, and for a stretch, she becomes a kind of mad crystal empress, an all-powerful ruler warped by the fruit. It is one of those early episodes that seems, at the time, like pure random weirdness, the show doing something bizarre for the sake of it, and it is only in retrospect, once you understand how the story plants seeds, that you wonder how much of it was intentional, and how much was just the early series being gloriously unhinged. Either way, it means that under the apple pie and the soft voice, Tree Trunks contains multitudes, including a brief reign as a crystal tyrant, and that is exactly the sort of secret that lives near the bottom of this iceberg. Peppermint Butler is another one, maybe the sharpest example of a character whose surface and depths are almost comically far apart. On the surface, he is Princess Bubblegum's butler, a small, round, red and white peppermint candy man in a little bow tie, polite, formal, the very image of a proper servant. Underneath, Peppermint Butler is deep into serious dark magic. He can sense evil, he summons demons, he has connections to the land of the dead, to Death himself, and to Hunson Abadir, Marceline's demon father who rules the Nightosphere. There are episodes where the mild little candy butler reveals a command of necromancy and dark forces that frightens even powerful characters. A whole hidden life of forbidden magic, conducted discreetly alongside his day job of serving tea. He is one of the show's best-running jokes, and one of its best pieces of hidden depth at the same time. A demonologist in a bow tie. Peppermint Butler's backstory gets a full exploration in one of the post-series specials, set in a place called Wizard City, which follows him as a student at a school for wizards and digs into his checkered magical past, including a history as a feared and forbidden magician. It is a lovely example of the franchise using its afterlife, the specials made once the main show had ended, to finally give a beloved minor character the spotlight he never quite got in the main run. The whole show is full of these figures who feel like they have entire lives happening just off screen, and part of what made the fandom so devoted is the sense that you could point at almost anyone in the background and find, if you dug, a whole buried story. Even Susan Strong, a character who spends a lot of the series seeming like a big, simple, monstrous humanoid, turns out to be something the surface never suggested. Susan is revealed to be a human, or more precisely a human cyborg, her real name Kara, connected to the hidden human colonies and the experiments done there. A person under the monster the same way there is a person under the Ice King, and a god under the penguin. The pattern is so consistent that it becomes a kind of thesis about the world itself. In Ooh, and Maybe, the show is suggesting, in life too, nobody is only the thing they appear to be from the outside. The monster is a person, the servant is a sorcerer, the penguin is a god, the grandmother is a former tyrant, the princess is a scientist queen with centuries of blood under her fingernails. Everyone is an iceberg, which is perhaps why an actual iceberg video about this show feels so natural, because the story was already built on exactly this principle, the idea that the visible part is always the smallest part. I keep coming back to how deliberate this feels, and how generous. A lazier show would have let its background characters stay background, would have used the penguin only for laughs, and the butler only for manners. Adventure Time treated even its smallest figures as though they deserved a history, as though the world would only feel real if it went all the way down, if there was always more underneath. And that generosity of imagination, the refusal to let anything be merely a prop, helps explain why the people who love this show love it with such intensity. It rewards attention almost infinitely. You can watch it as a small child and see a funny cartoon, watch it again as an adult and see a meditation on mortality, and watch it a third time as a devoted fan and start catching the depth charges planted in the corners, and each time it gives you a different, complete experience. Few things ever made are that layered on purpose. And speaking of layers the network did not always want you to see, it is time to talk about the parts of the show that got cut, censored, or quietly hidden away. It is worth stopping to think about just how much the network let this show get away with, and where the lines were drawn, because the story of what Adventure Time could and could not show tells you a lot about children's television in that decade. It dealt openly with death, with mental illness, with existential dread, with the trauma of surviving an apocalypse, with grief that never fully heals. It put an embodiment of memory loss and depression at the center of its best-loved character arc. It let a hero manipulate a girlfriend and be wrong about it. It aired body horror. None of that, remarkably, seems to have drawn the kind of intervention you might expect, perhaps because it was smuggled in under the cover of whimsy, so that the darkness was always deniable, always wrapped in something colorful enough that a casual censor might not catch what was actually being said. Where the series did run into censorship, tellingly, was mostly around the relationship between Marceline and Princess Bubblegum, which we have already traced, and it is worth adding one specific early example to what we said before. In the third season episode that first hinted at their history, there is a small moment where Marceline spits water onto Bubblegum's shirt, a playful, intimate, slightly provocative bit of business, and that moment was cut in the United Kingdom broadcast, trimmed away as too suggestive. It is a tiny thing, a few frames of a cartoon vampire being a brat, and it was considered too much in one country while airing untouched in another. That is the texture of how this kind of censorship actually works. Not grand bans, but small, quiet snips. A shirt here, a kiss there, the story arriving slightly different depending on where you sit. Some regions, Portugal among them, have a documented history of trimming that particular episode, and the finale kiss, as we noted, was removed entirely in several countries. The show also had a mechanic for foreshadowing doom that I love, and that sits in the deeper trivia, which is the croak dream. In Ooh, if you dream of the cosmic owl, a giant celestial owl who appears in dreams, it means the dream you are having is prophetic, a vision of something that will actually come to pass, often a death, a croak, hence the name. The cosmic owl is one of the pantheon of cosmic beings, alongside Prismo and Death and the others, and his appearance in a dream is a genuine omen within the rules of the world. This is the mechanic Finn abused in the Flame Princess story, trying to force a croak dream to come true for his own ends, and it is exactly the kind of specific, internally consistent piece of supernatural rules lawyering that made fans fall in love with the cosmology. The world has real physics to its magic, real rules about dreams and omens and death, and the story mostly plays fair with them. One of the things I most admire about the series, and it belongs in a discussion of its depths, is how much it was willing to leave unexplained. For all the lore, for all the backstory the miniseries filled in, Adventure Time never became one of those stories that has to answer everything, that flattens its own mysteries by over-explaining them. There are things about Ooh that are simply never fully resolved, corners of the world glimpsed and never returned to, characters whose stories trail off, questions it is content to leave open. Who exactly started the Mushroom War, as we discussed, is never nailed down. Plenty of the deep cosmic hierarchy is sketched rather than mapped, and that restraint is a strength, because it keeps the world feeling bigger than the story, keeps you holding the sense that Ooh goes on past the edges of the frame, that there is always more iceberg below the part you can see. A world that explains itself completely stops feeling like a world. Adventure Time never made that mistake. There is a real philosophical thread running under all of this darkness and all of this restraint, and it is worth naming plainly, because it is, I think, why the series endures. Adventure Time is, at its core, a series about impermanence. Everything in it is passing away. The old human world is already gone before the show starts. Characters age and die. The Ice King loses himself. Marceline outlives everyone. Even the treehouse, the home at the center of everything, is destroyed. And rather than fighting this, rather than pretending its heroes can freeze the world in place, the story accepts impermanence as the fundamental condition of being alive, and then asks the harder question, which is how you live joyfully anyway, how you love people you know you will lose, how you make a home in a world that keeps ending. That is a properly adult question, and it asked it in a form that 8-year-olds could watch, which is close to a miracle. And it saved its fullest answer for the ending, so let us finally go there, to the finale, to the war and the god, and the 1,000-year leap into the future. The finale of Adventure Time is called Come Along With Me, taking its name from that gentle credits song, and it is a 44-minute special that aired on the 3rd of September, 2018, counted as the final several episodes of the 10th season and the last of the whole run. And the thing that surprises a lot of people about it is what the big conflict actually is, because after 10 seasons of cosmic villains, of the Lich and the Crown and the deep mythology, the war the finale is built around is not a war against evil at all. It is a family feud. It is the Gum War, the conflict between Princess Bubblegum and her uncle Gumbald, the relative she created and then mind-wiped centuries ago, who has returned, restored, and wants his revenge and his kingdom. I find it a bold and fitting choice that the story's final large-scale conflict is not good against evil, but Bubblegum against the consequences of her own past. The Gum War is the bill coming due for everything we learned about her, the authoritarian who made her own subjects and erased her own family. There is no Dark Lord to blame here. There are just two powerful people who are related, who wronged each other, dragging whole armies into their unresolved history. It is a very grown-up idea about how conflict actually happens, that the biggest wars are often not about cosmic evil, but about family, pride, old wounds that were never healed. And Finn, the hero, spends much of the finale not trying to win the war, but trying to stop it, trying to find a way through that does not end in slaughter, which is its own kind of statement about what heroism means at the end of this particular story. And then, into the middle of this human, avoidable, tragic little war, the show unleashes its ultimate cosmic force. In the chaos and desperation of the conflict, GOLB, the primordial embodiment of chaos we descended to earlier, is drawn into Ooh, and suddenly the family feud is interrupted by the arrival of pure entropy, the thing that unmakes everything, and the petty war has to stop because now the entire world is under threat of dissolution. There is something pointed about that structure, the way the character's small, bitter, human conflict summons, in effect, the end of everything. As if the series is saying that our refusal to settle our smaller angers is exactly what opens the door to the void. The way GOLB is ultimately answered, through harmony, through the song called Time Adventure sung by the characters together, we have already talked about, and I will not walk through the mechanics of it again, but I will say that watching the whole cast, enemies and friends alike, united in a song against total annihilation, is one of the most moving climaxes animation has produced. It is not a battle, it is a chorus. And I will admit, it gets me every single time that a series which spent a decade teaching children about death chose, for its final image of salvation, not a hero landing the decisive blow, but a room full of frightened people, enemies and friends alike, deciding to stand together and sing in tune. There is a whole philosophy of life folded into that one choice. It says the thing that saves us is not power but connection, not the strong hand but the shared voice. And after everything the story had put its characters through, I believe it earned the right to say so. Out of that climax come the resolutions we have already followed in their own places, so I will only gather them here rather than retell them. Betty makes her enormous sacrifice and becomes something other than herself to save the man she loves. The Ice King is freed and becomes Simon again, human at last after 1,000 years. Fern finds his peace and leaves behind the seedling that becomes the great tree. These threads, the crown, the vampire, the grass clone, all come home in the same 44 minutes, which is a remarkable feat of finale construction, tying off a decade of accumulated story without feeling rushed, letting each of these long tragedies land its final note. But the boldest thing the finale does is its frame, because the entire special is told as a story within a story, narrated from 1,000 years in the future, long after Finn and Jake and everyone we know have lived their lives and passed on. In this far future, two new young adventurers, a cat-like creature named Shermie and a figure named Beth, who is descended from the line of Jake and Lady Rainicorn, are wandering a changed Ooh, and they find a relic, Finn's old mechanical arm, and they go seeking the King of Ooh to learn its story. And the King of Ooh, the ruler of this distant future world, the one who knows the old legend and tells it to them, turns out to be Bimo, the little living video game console. The character we underestimated at the very top of this iceberg has outlasted everyone and become the keeper of the whole history, the King of Ooh 1,000 years on, narrating the legend of the heroes to a new generation. That reveal lands so hard precisely because of everything we said about Bimo at the surface. Everyone else grew old and died, as people and dogs and even wizards do, and the small, sweet, seemingly disposable robot is the one who carried the memory of them all into the far future. The one you were sure did not matter turns out to be the one who remembers. And at the very end, Shermie takes up the Finn sword, striking the same pose Finn strikes in the show's title card, and the whole thing turns into a cycle, the sense that adventures will keep happening, that new heroes will keep rising, that the story does not end so much as pass into new hands. Whether Shermie is somehow Finn returned, reincarnated the way Finn was once Shoko, is a question the show deliberately leaves open, and fans have argued it endlessly, but the series itself will not confirm it, and I think that ambiguity is the right call. The point is not whether it is literally Finn. The point is that the pattern continues, that after every ending there is another beginning, that the world goes on being adventured in, long after any particular adventurer is gone. The story did not stop when the story ended, and the afterlife of Adventure Time is its own layer of the iceberg, because the franchise carried on the streaming service HBO Max, with a set of specials and then a whole new series. And these post-finale productions got to do something the main show never had the freedom to do, which is take their time with individual characters and speak more openly than a children's network broadcast ever allowed. The first wave was a group of 4-hour-long specials under the banner Distant Lands, released across 2020 and 2021, and each one took a corner of the world and opened it up. There was the BMO special we mentioned at the surface, sending the little robot into a space emergency and finding real depth in the character everyone loved. There was Obsidian, which followed Marceline and Bubblegum to the Glass Kingdom and let them exist openly as the couple the finale had finally confirmed, exploring their shared history with a frankness the main show could only hint at. There was Wizard City, which gave Peppermint Butler his origin story as a student wizard with a dark past. And then there was the one that hurts, Together Again, which reunites Finn and Jake, except it does so in the afterlife, in the dead world, because by the time of that special Jake has long since died of old age. So the reunion of the series' central pair, the boy and his dog whose friendship was the beating heart of the entire series, happens on the other side of death, two old friends finding each other again, beyond the end of their lives. It is exactly as bittersweet as it sounds, and it is a fitting encapsulation of what this franchise always was, willing to give you the reunion you desperately wanted, and then make you pay for it, with the knowledge of everything that had to happen first. Even the happy endings here come wrapped in loss. You get Finn and Jake back together, and the price of admission is that they both had to die to get there. The bigger post-finale event, though, is the 2023 series Fiona and Cake, which took one of the show's oldest and strangest ideas and built a whole show on it. Way back in the main series, there were episodes framed as stories the Ice King wrote, a kind of fan fiction in which the main characters were gender swapped, so that Finn became a girl named Fiona, Jake became a cat named Cake, and so on. For years, these were understood as exactly that, the Ice King's silly invented tales, non-canonical daydreams. And then Fiona and Cake arrives and does something audacious with them. It reveals that Fiona's world is not merely a story, it was actually created, made real, by Prismo, the Wishmaster, and hidden away inside the Ice King's mind. Fiona and Cake are real people, living in a real, if hidden, universe, and the series follows them. Fiona and Cake is, in a sense, the most direct sequel to everything we have talked about, because its emotional center is Simon Petrikov, the man who used to be the Ice King, now living as a human, decrowned, and grieving. He got his humanity back in the finale, which was supposed to be the happy ending, and the series is honest enough to show that getting what you wanted does not cure you. Simon is human again, and he is miserable, mourning Betty, unmoored, unsure what his life is even for, now that the crown is gone, and the woman he loved has become an unreachable cosmic being. It is a brave thing for the franchise to do, to interrogate its own happy ending, to ask what it actually costs a person to be restored after 1,000 years as someone else, and to admit that restoration and healing are not the same thing. The plot of the new series turns on a threat that will sound familiar from the deep lore, because Fiona's universe, being an unauthorized creation that Prismo made and hid, is considered illegitimate by the cosmic order, and a villain called the Scarab, a kind of god auditor whose job is to enforce the rules of the multiverse, sets out to erase Fiona's world entirely for the crime of not being supposed to exist. So the stakes are, once again, erasure, the deletion of a whole reality, the same ultimate threat GOLB represented, now framed as a bureaucratic enforcement action, a cosmic auditor coming to cancel a universe. Fiona and Cake, with Simon, hop across the multiverse trying to save their home from being audited out of existence. And in the resolution, GOLB, the being Betty became, returns and plays a part in confirming and protecting the legitimacy of Fiona's universe, before parting from Simon this time truly and permanently, a final goodbye between the man and the woman he lost in two different ways. I think it says something wonderful about this franchise, that even its streaming-era sequel, made years after the original ended, is still fundamentally about the same things, about impermanence, about identity, about whether a person or a world has the right to exist on its own terms, about the difference between getting what you wanted and being at peace. A second season of Fiona and Cake has since followed, so the story is still going, which means the iceberg is technically still growing, still adding layers beneath the ones we can currently see. And that feels exactly right for a show whose whole premise was that there is always more underneath, that the world goes on past the edge of the frame, that no ending is ever quite the end. If there is one thread I have not pulled on enough, and it deserves its own descent. It is the music. Because Adventure Time is, underneath everything, as musical a show as animation has ever produced. And its songs are not decoration, they are where it does some of its most important emotional work. This is a series that uses song the way a musical does, as the moment when a character says the thing they cannot say in ordinary dialogue. And it did it so often and so well that a huge amount of the story's emotional memory, the moments fans carry with them years later, are songs. The little theme at the front, written and sung by the creator himself, the gentle borrowed indie song at the back, and in between, dozens of original pieces ranging from throwaway comedy to music as affecting as anything ever put in a cartoon. A lot of the best of it came from Rebecca Sugar during her years on the series, and I have already talked about the song built from Simon's letters, so I will not describe it again, but I want to name what makes her songs work, which is that they are almost never about the plot, they are about feeling. There is a song called Everything Stays, sung in the context of Marceline's history, and its whole subject is the strange comfort and sorrow of change. The way things stay the same in memory, even as they transform in reality. The way a mother's small reassurances echo across a life. It is a lullaby, essentially, and it is about the exact theme the whole show is about, impermanence and how we hold on to what we lose, and it delivers that theme not through explanation but through melody, so that a child can absorb the feeling of it, long before they could put words to the idea. That is what the show's music does again and again. It teaches you how to feel something before you have the language for it. Then there is the Fries song, which sits at the completely opposite end of the register and is just as beloved. The petty, funny little number about Marceline's grievance against her demon father, which we touched on earlier. What is remarkable about the music here is that it holds both of these things, the profound lullaby about impermanence and the silly song about stolen fries, within the same sensibility, and treats both as legitimate. The comedy songs and the devastating songs come from the same place, the same willingness to let characters burst into music whenever the feeling gets too big for speech, whether that feeling is grief or annoyance. Marceline in particular is defined by her music, her bass, the axe-shaped instrument she plays, her whole identity as a performer, so that music is not just something the show does, it is woven into who its characters are. And the ultimate expression of how much the story believed in music is the finale, where, as we discussed, an actual song is the weapon that saves the world, where harmony literally defeats chaos. Think about how much a show has to believe in music to build its entire climax on the premise that singing together is the only thing that can stop the end of everything. Most action stories resolve on a punch, a blast, a clever trick. Adventure Time resolved on a chorus, on the idea that people singing in tune is a force in the universe, real and powerful, the opposite of entropy. That is not a throwaway conceit. That is the series' deepest belief made literal. The conviction that connection and harmony and shared feeling are not soft, sentimental extras, but are actually the fundamental forces that hold a world together against the dark. The music was never simply the soundtrack, it was the thesis. There is a lovely production detail in all of this, which is how much of the music grew out of the same homegrown, artist-driven process as everything else. The songs were often written by the storyboard artists and crew themselves, people like Sugar, rather than handed down from a separate music department, which is why they feel so personal, so tied to the specific characters and moments, so unlike the generic pop numbers a lot of children's shows deploy. The music of Adventure Time sounds like it was made by the same hands that drew the show, because to a real extent it was, and that unity of vision, the same sensibility running through the art and the writing and the songs, does a great deal to explain why the whole thing feels so coherent, despite being made by so many people over so many years. When people try to explain why this show landed the way it did, why it inspired such devotion, the music is always near the center of the answer. You can forget a plot. You do not forget a melody that made you cry when you were 9. The series planted its themes in songs, precisely because songs are how feelings survive, how they get carried forward through time, which is, once again, the show being about its own subject, even in its methods. It made music about memory, and then that music became memory, lodged in a generation of listeners who will be humming Everything Stays, or the theme song, or the finale's chorus for the rest of their lives, carrying a small piece of ooh with them, long after the details of the episodes have faded. That is about as close to the show's own idea of immortality as anything gets, to persist as a song in someone else's memory. And that brings us, finally, up out of the deep water, toward the question of what all of this added up to, what Adventure Time actually left behind. By any external measure, Adventure Time was a triumph. It won 8 Primetime Emmy Awards, a Peabody Award, which is among the highest honors in all of broadcasting and rarely goes to a children's cartoon, 3 Annie Awards, which are the animation industry's own prizes, and multiple British Academy Children's Awards, among others. That is a staggering haul for a show that started life as a rejected 7-minute short Nickelodeon thought was too weird. But the awards, impressive as they are not really where its importance lives. Its true legacy is in what it made possible, in the door it opened, and the artists it trained, and the expectations it changed about what an animated series aimed at children could be. Before Adventure Time, the conventional wisdom in American television animation was fairly narrow about serialization and emotional depth in kids' programming. The assumption was that children wanted episodic comedy, self-contained stories, no heavy continuity, nothing too sad or too complicated. Adventure Time helped shatter that assumption by proving, commercially and critically, that a young audience would not only tolerate but hungrily follow a show that got progressively darker, more serialized, more emotionally demanding, more willing to deal with grief and death and identity. It demonstrated that kids could handle a story with real stakes and real melancholy, and that a lot of adults would come along for exactly the same reason. And once it proved that, the floodgates opened. A whole wave of emotionally ambitious, serialized, visually distinctive American cartoons followed in its wake through the 2010s, many of them made by people who had worked on Adventure Time or been directly inspired by it. The clearest line runs through Rebecca Sugar, whose Steven Universe carried the Adventure Time sensibility forward and pushed even further into emotional and identity-focused storytelling. But she is far from the only example. The story's storyboard rooms functioned as a kind of training ground for a generation of cartoonists, and the influence of its methods, its storyboard-driven creativity, its willingness to let individual artists imprint their sensibility on the work, its blend of comedy and genuine feeling, its refusal to talk down to its audience, rippled outward across the industry. When people talk about a golden age of Western animation in that decade, a period when cartoons became a serious medium for emotional and even literary storytelling, Adventure Time sits very close to the origin point of that whole movement. It was the story that made the case, and once the case was made, everything downstream became possible. There is also the simple matter of how deeply it embedded itself in the culture. The characters became truly iconic, recognizable, far beyond the show's actual viewership, on clothing and merchandise, and in the general visual vocabulary of the era. The phrase, "Land of Ooh," the shape of Finn's hat, Bemo's little face, Jake stretching, these became shorthand, cultural furniture, the kind of thing people recognize even if they have never watched a full episode. And more meaningfully, the series became a touchstone for a generation of young people who grew up with it, many of whom found in it their first encounter with certain ideas, their first cartoon depiction of a same-sex relationship, their first story that took loss and mental illness and impermanence seriously in a form they could access as children. For a lot of people who are now adults, Adventure Time was formative in a way that goes well beyond entertainment. It was where they first learned some of the harder truths about being alive, delivered gently enough that they could bear them. What moves me most, looking back at the whole arc of it, is the distance the show traveled without ever betraying itself. It began as pure whimsy, Finn and Jake loose in a candy land, a viral short too strange for network television. It ended as a meditation on memory, mortality, love, and the courage to keep going in a world that keeps ending, having built one of the richest fictional cosmologies in the medium. And it made that entire journey without ever becoming self-important, without ever losing its silliness, its warmth, its willingness to stop everything cold for a joke or a song. It stayed funny while becoming profound. It stayed kind while becoming sad. That balance, that refusal to trade its lightness for its depth, or its depth for its lightness, is the rarest thing about it, and it is why it endures where so many darker or sillier shows fade. Adventure Time understood that a story can hold joy and grief at the same time, because life does, and it trusted its audience, even its youngest audience, to hold both too. And that, in the end, is what the whole Iceberg is really made of. Not a set of trivia and hidden reveals, though it has those in abundance, but a single, patient, generous idea about what it means to be alive in a world that does not last, an idea buried in the background of that very first shot of a ruined field, and slowly, lovingly, uncovered across 8 years of episodes and a handful of specials and a sequel that is still going. The story was always about the thing underneath. It was iceberg all the way down. Before we surface completely, there is one more layer of the iceberg worth lingering in for a while, and it is a strange one, because it is not really about the show itself, but about the relationship between it and the people who watched closely enough to theorize about it. Adventure Time had an unusually intense theorizing fandom, the kind of audience that pauses on background frames and reconstructs timelines and argues about cosmology. And part of what made that fandom so devoted is that the series kept rewarding them. It was a run where careful reading was often vindicated, where the wild theory turned out to be true more often than you would expect. And I want to look honestly at which readings it confirmed, which it left hanging forever, and which the audience got wrong, because keeping those 3 categories straight is its own small discipline. The biggest theory that turned out to be true was the whole future Earth premise. For a good while, before it was made explicit, attentive viewers were assembling the clues, the ruins in the background, the stray human artifacts, the hints about the Mushroom War, and concluding that this candy fantasy land was actually post-apocalyptic Earth. That reading started as fan speculation, and the series gradually, deliberately confirmed it, until what had been a theory became simply the setting. Bubbline is the other great example. For years, the relationship between Marceline and Bubblegum was, officially, subtext, deniable, a thing fans insisted on and skeptics dismissed. And the crew and its voice cast slowly moved it from theory to hint to confirmed canon over the course of many years. In both cases, the audience saw the truth before it would be said out loud, and the writers eventually caught up to their own most attentive viewers. Then there are the questions the series chose never to answer, the theories that will stay theories forever, because it deliberately declined to settle them. The clearest is who actually started the Mushroom War, which we have discussed, a question it gestures at, implies things about, but never definitively resolves, leaving the well-supported reading that the ancient evil manipulated humanity into it as an implication rather than a stated fact. Another is whether the future adventurer who inherits the sword at the very end is somehow Finn returned, reborn the way Finn was once revealed to have had past lives. It frames the possibility suggestively, invites the reading, and then refuses to confirm it. And it does that on purpose, because the ambiguity is the point. These are not plot holes. They are deliberate, open doors, questions it wants you to keep turning over rather than close. A story confident enough to leave its biggest questions permanently open is rare, and Adventure Time was that confident. And then there are the things the fandom got wrong, or overread, and it is worth being honest about those too, because a good theorizing culture also generates a lot of readings that do not pan out. Not every background detail was a clue. Not every strange early episode was secretly foreshadowing the deep lore, because a lot of the early show was, by the crew's own accounts, made loosely, improvisationally, without a grand master plan, and only later did the series start reaching back to retroactively connect things. So some of the connections fans drew between early randomness and later mythology are real, planted on purpose, and some are the natural result of a devoted audience finding patterns in what was originally just play. Part of the maturity of loving a show like this is being able to hold both, to appreciate the truly planted depth charges without insisting that every single odd moment was a deliberate piece of a master plan that, in truth, did not fully exist until the series grew into it. That distinction between what is canon, what is interpretation, and what is unconfirmed theory is actually the healthiest way to love any deep piece of storytelling. And Adventure Time is a wonderful teacher of it precisely because it operates so clearly in all 3 registers at once. There are things that simply happen in the show. Facts, the crown, the war, the kiss, the finale. There are things it implies and invites you to read into. The meaning of impermanence, the tragedy under the comedy, the argument that identity is not fixed. And there are things nobody can confirm. The origin of the war, the identity of the last sword-bearer, the parts of the cosmology that stay in shadow. The pleasure of an iceberg like this one is moving carefully between those layers, honoring what is known, arguing about what is meant, and wondering about what can never be settled, without ever pretending that a wonder is a fact. That is how you do justice to a show that was, itself, so careful about the difference between what it showed you and what it left underneath. There is one region of the series' cosmology we have circled without landing in, and it feels right to visit it here, near the bottom, in the dark and the quiet, because it is the region the whole series is secretly about. Adventure Time has an unusually concrete relationship with death. Most children's shows treat death as an unmentionable, a thing to be avoided or softened into vanishing or moving away. This one made death a place you could visit, a character you could meet, a set of rules woven into the fabric of the world. There is an actual afterlife in Ooh, a land of the dead, and there is an actual figure called Death who presides over a portion of it, a skeletal being you can seek out, argue with, even challenge, most famously in a musical duel. Death is not an abstraction here. He is a guy with a domain and a personality, and the characters can and do go deal with him directly. Alongside that realm of the dead, there is the Nightosphere, the chaotic infernal domain ruled by Marceline's father, Hunson Abadir, a demon whose business is the harvesting and consuming of souls. The Nightosphere is the closest thing the story has to a hell, a churning, dangerous place, and the fact that the fraught father of one of the main characters rules it gives even the cosmology of damnation a strange domestic intimacy. The underworld as, in part, a family property, a place Marceline visits the way you might reluctantly visit a difficult parent's house. This is very Adventure Time, to take the grandest metaphysical structures, heaven and hell and death itself, and thread them through with the small, ordinary textures of family and relationship, so that the afterlife is cosmic and also personal, terrifying and also, somehow, a place where your dad lives. And it is threaded through the smaller characters too, most notably Peppermint Butler, whose dark magic, as we found earlier, connects directly to death and that country of the dead, and to Hunson's domain. The series built a genuine web here, a consistent supernatural infrastructure of death and souls and afterlives that different characters reach from different angles. The sorceress Butler through his forbidden magic, Marceline through her father, ordinary characters through the simple fact of dying. It is a fully realized cosmology of mortality, sitting underneath a children's cartoon, and it is one of the reasons its treatment of death carries so much weight. When someone dies in Ooh, it means something specific, because the show has actually built the country that death leads to. All of which is why the post-finale reunion of Finn and Jake, set as it is in the dead world, hits the way it does. It is not a vague gesture at a happy afterlife. It takes place in a specific, established region of the show's carefully built cosmology, a real location on the map of the beyond, which means the reunion feels less like a comforting fantasy and more like a place the characters genuinely went. The story earned that scene by spending 10 years establishing that death, in this world, is a destination rather than an erasure. That the country beyond the living is real and mapped and populated, so that when the two of them find each other there, you believe it, because you were taught the geography of it long before you were taken there. I think the reason the run could be so unafraid of death, so willing to build it out and visit it and even joke about it, is precisely the impermanence at its core that we keep returning to. A story that accepts, from its very first shot of a ruined world, that everything passes away, has no reason to flinch from death. Death is not the enemy of a show like this, because it was never pretending its world would last. Instead, death becomes just another part of the landscape, sad and real and sometimes even funny, a country on the map like any other. And there is something deeply consoling in that, in a children's show, that neither hides death from you nor terrifies you with it, but simply, gently, includes it, tells you it is real and it is coming, and it is not the end of the meaning of things, that the people you lose go somewhere, that two old friends can find each other again even on the far side of it. Not many stories for anyone, let alone for children, are brave enough to say that. This one built a whole afterlife just to be able to. So that is the iceberg, or as much of it as one night can hold, from the warm, bright surface of Finn and Jake, all the way down to the cold, quiet floor, where the gods and the afterlives and the buried tragedies rest. And if you have stayed with me this whole way, drifting down through the layers, you have probably noticed that the deeper we went, the less it felt like collecting trivia, and the more it felt like uncovering a single, patient idea, dressed up in 1,000 strange and colorful costumes. A show that looked, at first, like nothing more than a silly cartoon, turned out to be one of the more honest things anyone ever made about memory and loss, and the strange, stubborn business of being alive in a world that is always ending and always beginning again. I keep coming back to that first image, the ruined field in the opening titles, the wreckage of our world lying half buried in the grass, while a cheerful little theme song plays. Everything the series would become was already there, in that one shot, if you knew to look. The whimsy on the surface, and the apocalypse underneath. The joke and the grief holding hands. Adventure Time spent 8 years and hundreds of episodes slowly turning the camera down toward that buried world, teaching a whole generation, gently, without ever frightening them, that the things we love do not last, and that this is not a reason to love them less, but a reason to love them more, while we can, for as long as we have them. That is a lesson a lot of adults never learn. This cartoon taught it to children, in songs, between the jokes, and it trusted them to be able to hold it. Its place in the culture is secure now, as one of the shows that changed what animation was allowed to be, that opened the door for cartoons to be sad and serious and beautiful and strange, that proved a young audience would follow a story all the way down into the deep water and come out the other side better for it. But its real legacy is smaller and quieter than that, and it lives in all the people who grew up with it and carry a piece of ooh around inside them, a melody, a character, a feeling they did not have words for at the time, and maybe still do not, a small warm certainty that even when the world is ending, there can be a treehouse, and a friend, and a song. Thank you for spending this time with me, and for letting ooh keep you company on the way to sleep. If your eyes have already closed, that is all right. The sound will stay with you. If you enjoyed the video, make sure to subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.